What an unbelievable story that's been totally forgotten by history because of its very scandalous implications for the world's biggest religion. This is where Jesus really came from. He came from a real group of people that had a long history of very virtuous and noble beliefs and practices. And I think the world deserves to know that.
From Jesus to the Essene Nazarene, they were based in truth and love.
All of these individuals were so devoted to their cause that they were willing to have themselves be brutally murdered in the stance of it.
John the Baptist, Yeshua the Nazarene, James the Just, Peter, like all of these incredible men of God. You know they were proud of their heritage and their beliefs, and they were willing to die for it and be persecuted for it. And they did, and their story deserves to be told.
It's up to us. It's time we vindicate this message.
Welcome to the Jesus Way podcast, a series dedicated to restoring the true gospel of Jesus. We believe that Jesus showed us the perfect way to God, so we invite you to walk the Jesus way with us. Hello and welcome back, divine beings. Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you, and welcome back to the Jesus Way podcast. I am so psyched, y'all, for today's podcast episode, because I consider what we're going to be talking about today as one of the most important pieces to the Jesus Way. And so if you're a devout follower of the Jesus Way, as we are, then you definitely want to stick around for today's episode, and you'll probably want to watch this one numerous times back to really soak in and absorb everything we're going to be going through and taking you through today. Because what we're going to be talking about today is the forgotten sect of Jesus and his first disciples, which of course is the Nazarene sect. And there's a whole lot of implications around this subject that are very explosive for Christian history and of course the Jesus Way. And so we're going to get into it today with our two favorite co-hosts, beginning with first Mr. James Bonifico. Thank you for joining us. And might I say, sir, you are looking quite snazzy in that shirt.
Oh, well, thank you, Aaron. I guess you could call me a Schnazarene.
Schnazarene. Now, if that's not a dad joke, I don't know what is.
That's a zinger.
And speaking of dad jokes, we're also welcoming back Mr. Kameron Waters, who is just now beginning to reemerge from the land of newborn fatherhood.
Oh yeah, he is risen.
Great to have you back on the show today, man.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm feeling inspired and full of life after all of the dirty diapers that I've been changing these days.
That'll do it, man. I'm curious, are you guys at the past the 3 month mark yet with Eden?
We're almost to, we're just passing 2 months actually. So it's still really fresh. Yeah.
Well, what I will say as a new father myself is that all the advice I was given that everything really does change right around after that 3 month mark was totally true in our case. So, you get a better feel for being a parent, number one, and then just right. Your baby also kind of starts to settle into their body a little more. So you're almost there, brother.
Yeah. There's the little glimpses where he's starting to formulate sounds that are starting to sound like talking in his own goo goo gaga way. And he just held his head up for like 3 minutes straight last night. And that moment, I mean, you can't even describe it. It's such a simple thing, but it's so profound. You're just like, oh my gosh, look at him, and so,
yeah, man.
Yeah, he's getting there. He's a strong little dude.
Yeah. All the little milestones really are just so beautiful and memorable. And you can't really, encapsulate for somebody who hasn't experienced it yet, like how much joy you can extract from something as simple as like my baby's making cooing noises or holding his head up by himself. It's one of the most divine experiences of a human lifetime, I think.
Agreed. Big time.
So with all that being said, guys, let's get into our meaty episode for today because we got a lot of ground to cover. And, I want to start off saying a couple of things to our audience of why this episode and this topic is so important. And first, I think it has to begin with wanting to understand the real living Jesus. If we want to understand the real living Jesus, which if you love Jesus, then you do, right? Then we have to study Yeshua the Nazarene, right? Rather than Jesus Christ of kind of Orthodox theology. We should be concerned with Yeshua the Nazarene's place of origin and his upbringing and the traditions from which he emerged, right? But the problem is, for millennia now, Orthodox Christianity has sort of long denied that Jesus has any real earthly origins. And they'll sort of just, they use the traditional Orthodox belief of, well, he was born of a virgin, kind of dropped straight out of heaven. So, he grew up in a town called Nazareth, but that's neither here nor there because small town, there's not much to look into here. And really what matters is that he was God. And, the interesting thing about that is that Yeshua the Nazarene was a real person from a real place with, he came up with an environment that taught him and trained him to believe and practice the different philosophies we see in the Gospels. Jesus was also the product of where he was raised, like every other human who's ever existed. And it might sound extreme, right, guys, to even claim that of Jesus, of like, oh, he was actually a real person from a real place. Heresy, right? But it's like, no, that's disrespectful to Yeshua the Nazarene, who's inspired the world for 2,000 years to say, he wasn't even really a person like us. Who cares about where he came from? I think Jesus would care were he, walking and talking among us today. I think Yeshua would care that we know where he came from. And so we definitely disagree with the Orthodox Christian view of Jesus, that he was just some, deity that was born to Mary in Bethlehem and happened to grow up in Nazareth, but nothing to see here. We actually think the opposite is true. We think that where Jesus was from tells us virtually everything we would want to know about how Jesus came about, his own teachings and philosophies that changed the world. And so in today's episode, we're going to show you the real historical Yeshua the Nazarene and how he really did emerge from a mystical sort of ascetic branch of Judaism that had split itself off from orthodoxy due to their, rejection of the temple and sacrifices and the corruption of the Torah and all these other issues. Jeremiah, Ezekiel both wrote about this idea, right? That the Torah had been corrupted, and some of these Jews took it seriously and actually split off from Judaism because of that issue, among others. And guess what? Yeshua the Nazarene emerged from one of those sects, or that sect of Essene type Judaism that rejected the temple and falsified Torah. And so just to add one more point on this, before we dive in, I think it's important to cover that the reason this topic is also so important to the Jesus way is because we've been trying for many, many months now to convey how important this message is, that there is a great scandal and conspiracy even at the heart of Christianity today. And I think the likes of which the world has never seen before in any other religion. And that is that in the beginning, Yeshua and all his followers were Nazarene Jews who were strict vegetarians, rejected the temple, all this stuff we've talked about. They were an Enochian type of mystical Judaism that thrived in the Galilean Transjordan region for many, many centuries. But this Nazarene sect of Judaism actually predates Jesus. And we're going to show you that in today's presentation. And Jesus emerged out of this mystical sect of Judaism in the first century. But here's where the tragedy comes in. After his life and ministry came to a sort of conclusion around 33 AD, it quickly became Hellenized and paganized by the Gentile Greek-speaking Christians who followed Paul's message and sort of made a big retreat away from the Jewish Christianity of Jesus's real origin with the Nazarene movement. And Paulinism sort of becomes the great heresy of Nazarene Christianity and James, the brother of Jesus, as we know. And so one of the common characteristics that links all Jewish Christian sects together, literally all of them that we know of, from the first century even through the fourth, is their rejection of Paul as an apostate and false prophet who corrupted the message of Jesus. And so as Paul's kind of pagan brand of Christianity made its way through the Mediterranean region, Christianity fell into the hands of these white aristocratic Roman Gentiles and church fathers who very much formed their own teachings and religion around Paul's, private Jesus and all of that, and completely forgot about the Jewish Christian origins of their religion. And so by the end of the second century, this is crazy to me. By just the end of the second century with Irenaeus and other church fathers, we already have Catholic church fathers deeming Nazarenes as a heretical Jewish sect and trying to outlaw their books, their writings, their practices in Rome. This is like 100 years after Jesus, And the Catholic Church is already naming Jesus' very own sect as heretics. Imagine the pride that it would take for something like that. And so according to the decree of, I think it's the decree of the Council of Rome or something in the 4th century, Nazarene Christianity was outlawed in Rome by Pope Damasus. And if a person was caught, they call it Judaizing, which means like adding Jewish beliefs or practices into Christianity. If somebody was caught practicing any form of Jewish Christianity, they would have all of their property seized by the Roman Empire. And in some worst cases, they could be executed for it. And so here is the scandal. And I can't overemphasize how important it is that all of our listeners really take a moment to sit with this. This is not conjecture. This is not speculation. This is provable historical fact that has been written about by numerous scholars and historians over the ages, and we're going to show you this today, that the Catholic Church, which is the origin of all Christianity today, is guilty of matricide. And matricide is a word that means essentially killing your own mother. That is, the Catholic Church, born out of Jewish Christianity, just 100 years later, turned right around and murdered their own mother, the Nazarenes. Jesus was a Nazarene, and all his followers, the first Christians, were called Nazarenes. And then 10 decades later, all Nazarenes are deemed heretics by the Catholic Church. I mean, this is an explosive scandal that the church has kind of tried to ignore and pretend like, this didn't really happen in the past. And no one's really pulled this fact out of the history books and really put it into the light to say, look what happened in church history. This is a scandal that deserves attention. Because look, let's be honest, right? There is no way that Yeshua's original message could have survived untainted by paganism in the Greco-Roman world he was born into. It's just not realistic, right? And so we're going to show you today how many of the Catholic Church fathers knew full well that they were in fact persecuting the very sect that Jesus himself and his first followers emerged from. So essentially what happened is the Gentiles stole the Jewish Christian religion from them, completely Hellenized it, scrubbed all Judaism out of it, all the mystical Jewish origins from the Nazarene movement, and then made a new Gentile religion out of it. We call it Paulianity, right? And then they turned around and called that very group heretics. This is matricide. This is what happened in reality in church history. And the Catholic Church has very much gleaned over this in the history books. But as you listen to this episode today, please keep this in mind, that this is why this topic is so important to recover the historical origins of Jesus and to tell the truth, right? What is true really matters. What actually happened in reality really matters and has a lot to teach us, especially about Yeshua. Jewish Christians focused on the message, while Gentile Christians focused on the messenger. And that's the difference between the two Christian traditions, right? Christianity became not about the message any longer, but the person of Jesus, right? Forget about the way of Jesus and just worship Jesus himself. And that's a travesty because it's only a message that can shift consciousness. Deifying a person, no matter who it is, can never shift the consciousness of humanity or aid humanity. And this is just something that has happened throughout history, right? Whenever a messenger becomes more important than their message, the message is already lost. And so the same truths that Jesus taught in the first century have been taught by many other, enlightened masters and prophets and sages and mystics across history. But in almost every case, humanity turns that person into a god and sort of forgets about their message after they're gone. This happened with Buddha, Krishna, prophets, sages, people we could name, right? This is not unique to Yeshua, this problem. But it did happen in the most extreme way with Yeshua, that what was once a pure message delivered from God through Yeshua became distorted and completely rewritten by the egos of dogmatic men. But it should be obvious, right, that messages from God don't require churches and institutions to carry them. A true message from God doesn't lead to hierarchy. It doesn't lead to control and enslavement and all of this. So if a message does lead to those things, then it's not a message of truth. True messages awaken right? They don't enslave people and create new dogmatic religions. And so the truth, as it is given purely, can't be weaponized. Before truth gets corrupted, it is only something that can save and liberate and bring freedom to everybody. And so this is why it shouldn't be a surprise to us that the Roman Empire could not afford to use Yeshua's mystical Nazarene teachings, but they had to opt instead for Paul's pagan Christianity instead, because Yeshua's salvation teachings can't be weaponized. They put all of the power of salvation squarely within your hands. You seek God, you repent, you forgive others, you love your neighbor, and you are saved. You have eternal life. That's the gospel of Yeshua. But an empire cannot raise an army under the banner of love your enemies. It doesn't work. You need something more divisive than that. You need labels like heretics and apostates and whatnot. And Paul's Christianity works perfectly for that because it's all about believing in the right doctrines, right? So if you don't believe in the right doctrines, well, then we're justified in hunting you and persecuting you and even killing you. And that is exactly what happened to the very first Christians, the Nazarene followers of the way, who were exterminated by the very church who stole their master's teachings. And that is why this subject matters so much to the Jesus way, and why we're going to take you on a bit of a historical journey into the true origins of the Nazarenes today, which is essentially the forgotten sect of Yeshua and his disciples. So with all that being said, thanks for allowing me the long intro there, guys. Cam, where do you want to start us off today on this conversation?
That was a great intro. You covered so much. And really what I'd love to add is just a little bit of background for how important, impactful, and pivotal this particular message has been in my own personal life. And that is because, as some may know, some may not, I'm the co-director of Christspiracy, a film that dives into a lot of this work, but specifically the animal sacrificial ritual and some of what we'll talk about today. But we originally, when we made this film, my co-director and I, about 2 to 3 years into filming, we started to produce our first edit and deliver it to Netflix because we actually had a pre-signed contract with Netflix based off of my co-director's previous success with his previous films. Netflix wanted to know what was coming up next. He and I were working on this film. And so they said, hey, cool, we'll go ahead and sign it on and we'll support you guys. Just keep us updated, you know? So we updated them in 2020 with our first edit. And amidst a number of notes they gave back, they had a very strong note against this Nazarene piece and the idea that Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, which we've all come to know, it's like, I mean, when you think about the average person's knowledge of Jesus, that's probably one of the most basic things. Oh, yeah, Jesus of Nazareth, right? And so they were really adamant about us staying away from bringing that into question. And it was really strange at the time, to be honest. There were a number of other notes too, but this was a big one. And so we ended up being kind of the contrarian investigative journalists that, you know, my co-director Kip is, but especially myself being so like, I have to know this truth. That once we felt that pushback, it was like we tripled down. We went into that research even further and deeper and implemented that aspect of the story even more prominently. And so when we showed them our next edit, needless to say, they weren't stoked on that. And we tried so hard. We tried so hard to see eye to eye on this point, and they just couldn't. We couldn't reconcile it. And it ended up being a pretty amicable split, but it was like, hey guys, with all due respect, you're doing this and we see what you're doing. So we're going to give you the reign to just go ahead. And we said, yeah, we got to stay true to the message. So one piece of the backstory too is like, I mean, it was such an emotional time that I remember weeping outside of my house the day that we finally had the call with Netflix and said, all right, we're done. We're fully parting ways. Their lawyers are going to call our lawyers, all of that. And coming from my background in music, I was a gospel musician and I had worked 6, 7 years of my adult life to become a gospel musician, to get signed by Sony Records. And immediately when I got signed by Sony Records, I stepped out of that scenario and that career to pursue this. So I had been through this one time already. So then
Wow,
here
I
I
didn't
am.
know that, dude.
Yeah, so here I am pursuing this, and I thought it was just like the greatest indication and blessing from God. Immediately, first film on this topic that I'm so passionate about gets immediately signed by Netflix. And then here I am again, stepping out of something to stay within truth, right? And I just wept and wept outside of my house with a few of my friends actually about just letting it go, you know? And to this day, it's been such an important mission for my heart of how much I love Jesus. Like this has to be vindicated. This has to be known by people. And like you said, it's not something that I've just discovered. It's not something that you've just discovered. There's been so many people that we'll talk about that have laid so much groundwork on this, but so much ridicule along the way for questioning these things. And I understand why to some perspective, because you're questioning a very foundational piece, and it feels like it's throwing the whole baby out with the bathwater. Part of the problem is this whole questioning of Nazareth as a misnomer was really picked up by mythicists uh, about 10-15 years ago, and they really ran with it to try to prove that just there's no historical Jesus at all. And I think that there's a little bit of remnant of the feeling that comes along with that crowd really holding that banner. And so, as we all know, not everybody gets everything right all the time, but some people get some things right some of the time that are really important. And so I think the mythicist crowd, had this piece that has a lot of validity to it, but it just doesn't work necessarily within that framework, right? And so this is the framework that this conversation needs to be in. It's the original Hebrew followers of Jesus in the first and second century. What does this Nazareth misnomer, and who are the Nazarenes really, and what implications does it hold for the truth of the world, who really wants to know who is this guy that's the most famous human being to ever live on planet Earth? Like, what in the hero's journey, I'm a storyteller. In the hero's journey, one of the most important points of the hero's journey in the act of storytelling is the origin story of the hero, of the character, where he's from. It's Luke Skywalker in Tatooine. If Luke Skywalker, somebody lied and said he wasn't from Tatooine and he was actually from the Death Stars, it would just mess the whole story up. It's a part of the story. So we really need to know, what is this land? What is this sect? Who are these people? And so I'm really excited to jump into it today.
Yeah, props to you, Cam, for sticking to your guns. I mean, that's a true sacrifice in the name of truth. And, a lot of people wouldn't have sacrificed their dream of being on Netflix for a truth that is really, it has so many profound implications. Later in the podcast, we're going to get into what those spiritual implications are for us, how we live our life, how we walk the walk. I think everyone listening, that's really important. How does this resonate with our actual path forward? Other thing I wanted to say is I've looked high and low on YouTube, and there is not a history of the Nazarene movement like we are about to put forth right now. And our goal with this is to arm everyone with this knowledge so they could go out into the world and go, hey guys, this is the true history. And this is how it's devolved or distorted in the mainline Christian tradition. So really, we want to spread this wide and far, because this piece of the puzzle, this Nazarene piece, has so many crazy implications for everything.
It really does, man. And yeah, your story is so inspiring, Cam, with the Netflix signing. We would do well to have the same type of zeal that you have for Jesus in this regard of, no, what's true really matters. And I'm not going to just allow the Catholic Orthodox Christian world anymore to take Jesus away from humanity and say, no, he wasn't like you. He was a God who came from heaven, and he wasn't like a person that was born somewhere and all that. It's like, no, Jesus was like us. He was a human being born like we were all born. We're going to show you a lot of this today. But it's like, we need that humanizing of Jesus. We need to relate to Jesus. We need a Jesus we can all sink our teeth into and understand and relate to and say, okay, if Jesus can do this, then so can I. And Jesus himself said that. And so I just take great inspiration, Cam, from you making that decision, because I mean, would you say it's safe to say that the reason that we can't go on Netflix right now and watch Christspiracy is because of this very issue on the Nazarenes we're going to talk about?
Well, I can say it's the core reason for me. Kip and I had multiple conversations about the hindrances, the pinch points between us and Netflix. And we tried to talk about and put out our pros and cons and what are we willing to compromise? And this just wasn't one that I was willing to compromise at all. I had seen enough by that point to know that I was borderline infuriated by the fact that this was a piece that was even in question, and how they couldn't see that it served the story so importantly, And so that's the thing. I don't want, like, Netflix, it could have just been that they thought that it wasn't necessary in the device of the storytelling. Maybe there was something deeper. Maybe someone saw the edit or some conversation happen that was like, hey, we don't want to go there for even greater implications. I don't know. But I'll just say it was very insistent on their side. It's not going to go there. And I was very insistent on my side that it is. And so that was a big point for me personally that made me know that I had to step away. And I can only see that this is something that's happened throughout history. Like, as we go through this conversation today, you'll see the concerted effort to overwrite this group of people that is so incredibly important to our history of humanity. And also, we can even see it still happening today. Like, we'll talk about it. For instance, I challenge anyone after this podcast, just go to Wikipedia and type in Nazarene, the title, and just read the first paragraph. And you'll see in the first paragraph the way that the information has to present itself, Jesus of Nazareth. But very quickly in the first paragraph, there's just enough seed of question around the sectarian name and the fact that maybe this doesn't mean people from a place, but it means people with a certain religious adherence, right, or ideology. And the irony is, I've got record of this over the last 4 years alone. That section of Wikipedia keeps getting taken out. And I actually go into Wikipedia and refute it about every year or so. I'll notice it disappears, and I go into Wikipedia because I don't know if anyone's ever used Wikipedia before, but you can go and add your vote, like, hey, we got to get this back in. And so I'll reverse it all the time. But someone is trying to remove that from the Wikipedia page too. I don't know.
Burning books.
Yeah.
Wow, man. Well, I mean, let's go ahead and jump into it then. We got a lot of slides to get through. And so I have a quote here from Professor Matthew Black of St. Andrews University. This was in 1969. And I think he describes the Essene movement very well here. He says, provided we do not define Essenism too narrowly, for instance, by equating it exclusively with the Dead Sea group, but are prepared to understand the term as a general description of the widespread movement of anti-Jerusalem, anti-Pharisaic, non-conformity of the period. It is from such Essene type of Judaism that Christianity is descended. Now, this is a killer quote for a number of reasons, but you're going to understand just how good this description is in a moment when we go through all the different Jewish Christian sects of the 1st and 2nd centuries and onwards, that we're dealing with a lot of different groups, right? And that can be a bit confusing for readers today because we don't really understand the ancient world very well, because this was a world before cars, really any transportation, social media, internet. These pockets of communities were super isolated from each other. And so the most important thing for scholars and historians is to trace and map the beliefs and practices of groups, religious sects and groups, to identify where they're correlated. And when we look at all these different Jewish Christian groups from the first few centuries, we've got Nazarenes, Ebionites, Elkosites, Essenes, Carmelites. These are all different types of Essene groups. And so here's the way to understand Essenes now. As we've said, the word Essene doesn't appear anywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it is the word that Philo, Josephus, and Pliny used to describe these ascetic Jews living in the Transjordan region. And scholars say, where'd they get this weird word from? And why are they employing it to describe these groups that most scholars identify as the Essenes and the Nazarenes? Because Josephus and Philo especially describe their beliefs in great enough detail that scholars go, oh, they're talking about the Essenes. Oh, that's the Nazarenes. Nazarenes are pro-marriage, Essenes anti-marriage, these kind of things. But they don't use those words. They use Essenes. And so when we study other church fathers and early historians and writers from around these periods, we get this feeling that the word Essene was kind of like a catch-all term for ascetic kind of Jewish Christian groups that lived in the Transjordan region and had all of the same practices. And this is the key point, that Essenism, as Professor Matthew Black describes it, is exactly what we've said already. Anti-temple, anti-sacrifice, believing in the corrupted Torah, vegetarians, rejecting Paul. You have these distinct beliefs and practices, atonement baptism, communal living. All of these groups we just named share these identical beliefs, and they share them across a period of like 400 years. And I think that says a lot about the cohesiveness of their belief system. And so this Essene type Judaism is a better way to understand all of these Jewish Christian groups we're going to go through in the Transjordan region, practicing all of these same ideologies.
And this Essene type Judaism didn't start there. This is a spiritual tradition rooted in truth. I think there's always the flame keepers of truth alive somewhere in the world. And it goes back to the Pythagoreans 500 years earlier, who shared these same common characteristics. And then there's evidence that there were Zoroastrian sects and certain sects in India that kept these same core principles. So the flame stays alive throughout every generation. And that's what we're here doing today, keeping that flame alive.
And for all the for everyone who is listening that may be a creedal Christian or has a creedal Christian background, we'll also show in a number of these slides the remnants of evidence of the early stages of this group in the canonical Bible in the Old Testament, drawing some connections. So, this is something that in Jesus's day was a completely non-controversial topic. Everyone knew who the Essenes were and what they were about, and they might not have agreed with them, but it's not like we're pulling some data out of the dark web or something here. This is like a very, very attested to group of people.
Well, to that point, like we have Josephus, for example, describing the Essenes as a group that lives around Mount Carmel, right? And then we have I don't know if it's Epiphanius or some other church father describing this group called the Carmelites that live in Mount Carmel, not that much later. And it's like, okay, so see, the Essenes actually had a different designation as well called the Carmelites. And so we have historians studying these groups later going, there was the Essenes, and then there was also the Carmelites. And it's like, no, they're actually the same group, but just across time, the names change and evolve a little bit. So you got to think about this stuff with a little bit of nuance, because history is messy business to try to sort out. Among the terms by which the Qumran community referred to themselves was keepers of the covenant, which appears in the original Hebrew as Nozrai Habrit. From this term derives the word Nazrim, one of the earliest Hebrew designations for the sect subsequently known as Christians. The modern Arabic word for Christians, Nasrani, derives from the same source. So too does the word Nazarean or Nazarene, which of course was the name by which early Christians referred to themselves in both the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. So when the Gospels call Jesus the Nazarios, are they telling us his hometown or his spiritual lineage? What if it wasn't about geography at all, but a label connected to a long-standing Jewish sect that rejected animal sacrifice, opposed the temple elite, and practiced a symbolic, compassionate version of the Torah? The Nazareans might be the missing link. So now we have part one of our little historical journey here. Are we talking about a sect or a city called Nazareth? So here's our linguistic evidence. We have these two Greek spellings or designations, Nazarios and Nazarinos. I'll let you take from here, Cam, but basically the point here is that we have Nazarios used about 12 times in the New Testament, whereas Nazarinos is only used twice. So you want to unpack a little bit here, Cam, for us, the difference in these two terminologies?
Totally. And I'd start by saying, if anyone's got a good old-fashioned King James Bible close, go grab it and open up the Gospels and have a look and let me know if you can find anywhere in that text that says Jesus of Nazareth, and I'll give you $100.
Wow, really?
Because ironically, King James version of the Bible has the correct translation of this. All the other translations really struggle, but it goes to show you that in some way, trying to pull the accuracy and understanding the linguistics a little bit closer to the origin of the story, they got that part right. So
I didn't know that.
yeah, it's because, and like I said, another challenge, go to Wikipedia right now, and hopefully if no one's pulled this commentary out of the very first paragraph, you'll see that there is the biblical encyclopedia that goes into depth about how these two Greek spellings, both of them actually seem to denote a sectarian or religious title. But Nazarios, the first one here on the slide, it's so complicated in the Greek to try to derive it from Nazareth that it's nearly impossible. There's an extra vowel that complicates the whole thing. So we know just from that term alone that this is more of a sectarian title. It's the same title, as we'll see, I'm sure, in a future slide, that Paul is being accused of being. There's all kinds of evidence throughout our Gospels that can prove this sectarian name. And the greatest of all is that, it says here on the slide, Nazarenes is used 12 times throughout the Gospels, and Nazarenos is used twice only. So this is the dominant spelling, regardless. Matthew and John actually exclusively use that term, Nazareos. It's only Luke that goes back and forth between the two, but actually in Luke, still Nazareos is the dominant designation. And then we even see in Mark, our earliest Gospels, as attested to by all scholars, that, Matthew and Luke were borrowing from an earlier Mark. Mark doesn't have any mention of Nazareth at all. It's just got what we'll show later on in one of these slides is an interpolation, but Mark uses this Nazarene designation. So there's some tension there. So clearly there's a tension around the use of this name in our Greek Gospels. And there's probably a reason for that we'll get into later. But I guess I would sum it up in saying that this Nazarene title really comes to a head when you understand that it's one of the most popular and famous images that we've seen of Jesus on the cross is the sign above his head, right? And on that sign, in the Latin, and also it says that it was in Greek, it was in 3 languages or whatever, it's Jesus the Nazarene, the Nazarios, right? So he's literally crucified with this designation. And I think this is a key piece in understanding how prominently he was understood at that time to be someone who emerged from this sect, and that it was something that people really didn't prefer or like about him when they put him up on the cross. So
imagine if it said Jesus the Pharisee or Jesus the Sadducee.
Right.
And we wouldn't be having this conversation. So we have this next slide about the prophecies from the Hebrew Bible, saying that there's no such prophecy that exists in the Hebrew Bible that Jesus, what verse is this from in the New Testament? Somewhere in Matthew it says, he shall be called a Nazarene. And there is no prophecy in the Bible that says the Messiah will be called a Nazarene, but it probably is referring to Isaiah 11:1, which says, a shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, a branch, the Hebrew word is netzer, shall grow out of his roots. So netzer is the root word where we get Nazar or Nazarean or Nazrim. And so essentially the designation Jesus the Nazarene, if netzer is the word branch, would mean like Yeshua the branchite is kind of what that would mean. And I think that is a huge piece of evidence, Cam, that you pointed out. I'm glad you did. Like, why would they crucify somebody with the name of the town they were from? Like, nobody cares where this person's town is from, like, especially if it's a small town like Nazareth. But what would be really important to people is to know what, designation, what religious affiliation this person being crucified was. Was this a Pharisee being crucified? Is this a Samaritan being crucified? Is it a Nazarene being crucified? Because there was a lot of infighting among those groups, and they would have wanted to know. That would have been an interesting fact for them to put on the cross compared to a town. So yeah, it's like we got to start thinking a little bit differently about the way that the ancient world worked from the way our modern day world works.
It's a warning. It's a warning to other Nazarenes. It's a warning about what opposing the temple system, what it will get you.
We have to understand that, we've talked about this on the podcast before, that his act in the temple really is what instigated the arrest, trial, and crucifixion anyways, because otherwise the Roman authorities don't really care if some itinerant rabbi is running around telling people that that a lot of people said and did the kind of things, in that time they would make these claims that they were a Messiah or some type of healer or whatever. But it was this insurrectionist act in the temple that really got him in trouble. And then, to your point even further, Aaron, what is on the title on the sign? It's King of the Jews, Jesus the Nazarene. So King of the Jews is the problem with the Romans. There's a political connotation to that. There's the understanding that, this group could actually overthrow or, get strong enough that they could be a real problem politically for us here. And Jesus the Nazarene indicates the problem to the local Orthodoxy, because they weren't fans of the Nazarenes. They were the hated sect that were cursed in the, later in the Talmud and everything. So it totally, to your point, that's a great point. I never even thought of the way that you just worded it, that what a weird thing if they put King of the Jews and then the second thing was just Jesus of Nazareth. Like, who cares? Like, it's definitely, they're trying to make a statement. If you've got just a little bit of real estate on top of this cross and you want to send a message, that definitely makes more sense to put the sectarian name.
I mean, we know the Nazarenes opposed the temple and believed the Torah was corrupted. And we know that the Orthodox Jews, Pharisees, Sadducees, would have had a big problem with that. And we know that they did not like Jesus' cleansing of the temple, and that Mark 11:18 says, after Jesus cleansed the temple and pronounced condemnation on all of it, it says, after Jesus said these things, the priests immediately started planning how they would put him to death. And so when you see this sign above Jesus, Jesus the Nazarene, here hangs Jesus the Nazarene, they're really trying to crucify the ideology. That's what the sign is for. It's like, we are nailing this belief system that we hate to the cross. This is a Nazarene being crucified. I mean, that actually makes sense why you would write that on someone's crucifixion rather than, that's Aaron from San Jose.
Yeah, it's what is he guilty of being? No one's guilty of being where they're from. He's guilty of being a Nazarene.
Yeah, they usually use a description. Like if someone deserts a unit in a war and they're executed, it will say deserter. If someone is, they want to indicate what the ideology or action or mindset was that led to their death.
Yeah.
Not some podunk town that no one would have heard of Nazareth. We're going to get into it later, but there's no mention of it in the historical text before what, 200 AD?
Yeah.
Well, so we debated this point, Cam, with Stephen and Wes a little bit, or actually it was a response video to Wes and Stephen's video about Stephen was trying to pick apart this quote we pulled out of Epiphanius here, talking about the Nazarenes were the first Christians, and they also had another designation for a short period of time, the Essenes. So can you read this for us, James, and then we'll unpack the implications of it a little bit.
Sure. This is Epiphanius, Panarion 29:1. For these people did not give themselves the name of Christ or Jesus, his own name, but that of Nazareans. But at that time, all Christians alike were called Nazareans. They also came to be called Essenes for a short while, before the disciples began to be called Christians at Antioch. But they were called Essenes because of Jesse, I suppose, since David was descended from Jesse, and Mary was a lineal descendant of David. This was in fulfillment of sacred scripture, since in the Old Testament the Lord tells David, of the fruit of thy belly shall I set upon thy throne.
So we won't spend too much time on this, but suffice to say that this is an important quote because, what Wes and Stephen were trying to say in our debate was, oh yeah, we know that Jesus was called a Nazarene. And we have these later sects of the Nazarenes, Ebionites from the 2nd century on, but they're totally not related. those Nazarenes aren't the same Nazarenes as Jesus's group or whatever. And we were trying to argue the point that no, they definitely are, because we know they share the same unique common beliefs, which are atonement baptism as an alternative to sacrifice, being against the temple and the sacrificial system, and living in community, voluntary poverty. And there's no other Jewish sect we know of than the Jewish Christians who practice this. We have the Essenes of the Qumran group that were practicing these things, and the Jewish Christians of the New Testament we have on record. And so here we have another slam dunk piece of evidence that the very first Christians, before the name Christian was invented, were called Nazarenes and Essenes. That's how they identified themselves. And the reason they identified themselves as these two names is because they were trying to show that they were the fulfillment of the messianic prophecy, Isaiah 11. A stump will come out of Jesse, a branch, a netzer. These are the two designations. Jesse is the father of David. So they're saying, hey, our guy, Jesus, was the Davidic Messiah. And of course, Nazareans, being netzer, he was the shoot that came out of Jesse. So they're naming themselves after messianic prophecies, which further corroborates the point that the very first Christians did not think Jesus was Yahweh packaged in a human body. They believed he was the Davidic Messiah, the Jewish Messiah that the scriptures had foretold. And it wasn't until much, much later, 100 years or more, that the Gentile tradition of the Mediterranean, Asia Minor regions, they began to say, Jesus was really like a demigod who came from heaven, like Apollos and Heracles and Perseus. The Jewish Christians repudiated such ideas as heresy. No man can be God. Even as Jesus said, why do you call me good? No one's good but God. This is a strict Jewish belief that God is not a man. It's all through the Old Testament, right? And these designations actually prove that point in a very emphatic way, I think.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, Epiphanius, has a really hard time with origin stories, and we'll see that through some more of these slides. He's always kind of fumbling around, trying to understand where these people came from and what their names actually are. And thankfully, he preserves a lot of truth throughout it, but we have to kind of take some of his naming and designations with a grain of salt and see through the cracks of what he's saying. But what's so great is that he's acknowledging that they were called Jesseans for a short time. And again, like you mentioned, Stephen in his follow-up video after our debate was really trying to hang us up on that note without realizing that it's actually a greater proof to the point. And an even further proof to the point is that it shows the Jesseans and the Netzer, the branch coming from Jesse, the Jesseans, the Nazarenes, it's all referring to the same prophecy. And it shows that like a town of Nazareth is kind of unnecessary with this understanding. Like Jesse is a person, and just like Israel was a person, and Israel became known as the nation of Israel after the person. Judea became named after the person of Judah. So they're utilizing these prophetic names and these tribal ancestral designations. So clearly, if there was ever at some point, early or later, a town called Nazareth, it would be named that after the Nazareans and after the branch and after that prophetic movement. They wouldn't go out of their way and designate themselves based off of some random little place. It's the other way around for sure.
It's the same way in the United States. I'm in Austin. It's named after Stephen F. Austin, one of the founding fathers of Texas. And all over the world, that is always the case. The town name is named after someone or a group.
Well, I mean, the way that Hebrew thought worked back in those days in ancient times was like people were also like archetypes that represented certain messages God had given humanity across time. So like Moses, when people say, obey Moses, they really mean obey Mosaic law, the law given through Moses, right? Moses isn't walking around such that they could go walk up to Moses and obey him, right? It's a metaphorical kind of way of saying follow what Moses represents, which is the law. Same with Abraham and the prophets, and everyone has a unique meaning in Jewish history. And so is the same with, of course, Jesse, the father of David. Now, this next piece of evidence, you guys, I think is so huge. A letter from a 3rd century Greek writer, Julius Africanus, in his letter to Aristides. He says, and among these happen to be those already mentioned, called Desposini, on account of their connection with the family of the Savior. And these coming from Nazara and Kochaba, Judean villages to other parts of the country. So this Greek word here that's highlighted, Desposini, was employed to indicate the Lord's relatives as being according to the flesh. The term means literally those who belong to a master. And so it was originally used to signify one's heirs. So this letter from Julius Africanus dates to about 220 CE. So this is early 3rd century. And he mentions Nazara as a kind of region, Kochaba as well, in Judea. And he literally calls them the heirs of the master, the descendants of Jesus, essentially. He says, we're living in this region called Nazara. That's a very early attestation to this word Nazara, which we also see in John 1:45. Now, this actually came to me, guys, just as I was doing research for this episode. I was like, wait a minute, what about the famous quote where, was it Philip or Nathaniel says, what good can come out of Nazareth? And I thought, I wonder what that word is in the Greek. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph. Did you catch that? Jesus, son of Joseph, not Mary, from Nazareth. Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip said to him, come and see. So we see here the Greek spelling is the spelling for Nazara. So it's been rendered incorrectly in English here as Nazareth. It should be rendered Nazara, because that is the correct Greek transliteration. So, I mean, I think those 2 points right there show that Nazareth was actually probably not a town, but more of a region in the Transjordan area, the Galilean area.
Right. And some will say, because I saw this Julius quote, and he says it's in Judea. And then I'm sure anyone watching this who's got their apologetics hat on is going to say, well, wait a minute, that points more to Nazareth, the town. Seems like Nazareth, the town, is in Judea. It's got to be the town that he's referring to there. But then there's a problem. Like I said, Epiphanius thankfully preserves some really good points that we can corroborate with his designation and history of these groups. And Epiphanius mentions Kochaba, the second place, which Julius says are both in Judea. Epiphanius mentions it in the Transjordan alongside Pella and everything. So I think that probably Julius is just considering there's this idea in that time that Judea is just kind of this whole area that's not just what we know of as modern day Judea, but it's the area where the people of that faith live, that province lives. So the Transjordan on the other side could be compared to it. And as we'll see too, as we go into this, like the region of the Galilee, we've always thought of it as just west of the Sea of Galilee, where Capernaum is and everything. But when you actually look into ancient history, the region of Galilee goes to the east side as well. That's where Judas the Galilean was from the east side. And so there's this idea that across the Sea of Galilee, across the Jordan into the wilderness, so to speak, there's this encampment of the Nazara, or the Nazarenes, along with some of their different settlement names. Even Damascus, as we'll show, is a part of this whole, number of cities in this area. So, but this is such a great point with John 1:45 through 46, because so many Christians, when I've had this conversation about the existence of Nazareth, they bring up this verse, but it says, doesn't any good thing come from Nazareth? And it's such a badge of honor, I think, for Christians in general, because it's like, oh, look, they're pointing to like the hick boy, right? The guy in the small town that's like, oh, that small town, and he puts it on the map. But the understanding is the same thing could be applied to a whole region that's considered the boonies. Basically, it's not a town that's just a small town. It's literally the boonies. It's outside of, the civilization and the modern culture.
Well, I even think, Cam, that this might even be a derogatory kind of slight against the way that Orthodox Jews in Judea thought about Nazarene Jews in those days, right? It might be like, oh, those hippie Nazarene Jews out in the Transjordan, what good can come out of that hippie group of Jews? It's almost like that, isn't it?
Yep, exactly. I resonate with that.
Bit of a slander.
Yeah, it's a slander, and we see, like I said, there's the James, do you remember the name of the curse against the Nazarenes from the Talmud? It's there's a particular name for it. The Birkat ha-Minim, Berkat Hamanim is
That's the name of it?
yeah, that's the name of the curse, and it says, "May this is literally word for word from the text of the Talmud, where it says, "May the Nazarenes Hanatzarim and the sectarians perish in a moment," literally condemning death on them. "Let them be blotted out of the book of life and not written together with the righteous." So that's how they felt.
Wow, they were as harsh on the Nazarenes as Paul was on anybody who doesn't believe in his gospel.
Right. Yeah,
Let them be accursed, baby.
This sect really had it out for them because they were first hated by Orthodoxy and Judaism for their beliefs. And again, that word branch, "there shall be a branch that comes from Jesse," alludes to this. They're a netzir, a shoot, is when a tree produces a branch that you can pull off and root it, and it becomes a whole new tree. So that's that's the way they were seeing their ideology. Hey, we're restoring back to our in laying the foundation of the true roots of the faith again and producing fruit from that. And so, that's heresy to the orthodoxy of Judaism at the time. So they were first hated by them, and then as time went on and orthodoxy of Christianity was founded, then they became hated by them. So they're like sandwiched in the middle of these two forces, just hated by everyone because of their beliefs and purity of what they were trying to adhere to.
They had a rough go of it, man. So we have this map here that some researcher put together that shows you what was likely the Nazara region. So we have Jerusalem down here, and then Jordan River all the way up here to the sort of Galilean region. So that's kind of interesting to think about. It might have been not just one little town, but an entire region.
To your point about the cities, Epiphanius refers to the Decapolis when they fly, the flight to Pella and where the Nazarenes were settled, which literally means it's the place of 5 cities. So there's a cluster of these different settlements where these groups were stationing themselves.
We also know that Damascus was another big Nazarene city of dwelling for them.
Right.
So we have some other evidence here that Cam put together for us. The Encyclopedia Biblica, which I think is probably the most respected biblical encyclopedia on earth, states that it is doubtful whether Nazareth was the dwelling place of Jesus. Nazareth is not mentioned even once in the entire Old Testament. The book of Joshua, 19:10 and 16, in what it claims is the process of settlement by the tribe of Zebulon in the area, records 12 towns and 6 villages, yet omits any Nazareth from the list. The Talmud, although it names 63 Galilean towns, knows nothing of Nazareth, nor does early rabbinic literature. St. Paul writes nothing about Nazareth, and no ancient historian or geographer mentions Nazareth until 200 years after Jesus' death, and it is first noted at the beginning of the 4th century. When we also look at the sectarian names, as we've talked about so far, we find this other interesting point that there are no other Jewish sects we know of that were named after towns. Not the Pharisees, not the Sadducees, Essenes, Zadokites, Samaritans. These are all ideological designations, not geographical designations. I think that's a big point too. And then now we're going to get into some of the nerdy stuff of stylometrics and textual evidence, which we really love. Mark 1:9 says Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, while the parallel passage in Matthew 3:13 does not mention Nazareth. So what can you unpack the implications of that for us, Cam?
Yeah, so Mark 1:9, which again is noted to be the earliest gospel, and the only mention of the word Nazareth in the Gospel of Mark is this instance in Mark 1:9. However, Matthew, when he's borrowing from that verse, almost word for word, he doesn't mention Nazareth. So it's an indication, because we know that Mark was edited over time. Even, Wesley Huff and many others are in agreement that the long ending of Mark is an addition to the text that now many are having. We see it in our Bibles, the notation that Mark has been added to at the end. So we know that Mark was edited. So most likely one of these earlier accounts of Mark that we don't have, because we don't have like 1st century manuscripts of these things. It most likely didn't have that name in that verse, or Matthew would have recorded it as such. He clearly, didn't just leave it out for no reason. So So if, based on the account in Matthew, now we can deduce that the Nazareth is an interpolation in Mark, and therefore our earliest gospel most likely had no mention of Nazareth at all. Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian who is, infamous around the world for his completely just utter detailed accounts of that time period. And in fact, he's one of the number one, I would guess you could call it, secular historical accounts for the existence of Jesus that most apologists will use or refer to. He's a big, big deal in terms of proving the historicity of Jesus. He goes in depth in his history of the Jewish wars and talks about the towns in Galilee. And he lists, I think, somewhere around 50 to 60 towns and small hamlets. And
Oh yeah, I have a slide on that.
Yeah, he doesn't mention Nazareth. And he literally lived in Sepphoris, right next to Nazareth. So it's extremely odd that
he lived in Sepphoris.
Yeah, he was doing his account from Sepphoris when he wrote that.
That is an incredible next slide, point. Actually. I mean, you could see, can see Nazareth from Sepphoris,
right?
Or in the modern day or whatever. Sepphoris is ruins or whatever, but I believe it's a hill.
Right.
And if you're in Nazareth, you could see it very clearly, that hill that Sepphoris was on. So that's an impossibility. If Nazareth was there at the time, that Josephus wouldn't know about it. The only other option would be if it was such a tiny little village that he didn't even think it was necessary to add.
Yeah, even that I would refute, because we have a slide on this coming up that you'll see, but it's actually even worse than that when it comes to the Josephus records. But on this point, really quick before we move on, I think it's interesting that, to your point, Cam, if you're going to add the word Nazareth in, you would add it into the earliest gospel, right? You'd say, we got to add it into the earliest source so we can proof text this so that people don't say, oh, well, this is just in Matthew only, so it's clearly a later edition. They were very smart in that way about the way they interpolated. But I think the why did they interpolate is the bigger issue, and part of the scandal that this episode is dedicated to uncovering is that, again, by the early second century, mid-second century, the Catholic Church fathers and leaders are already treating and calling Nazarene Christians heretics. And this would have been something that would have caught a lot of people's attention of like, hey guys, Jesus was part of that sect 100 years ago. Maybe we should tone it down a little bit. And of course, they didn't probably want to tone down the hate fest, because that's what the church fathers are known for, right? Is against Marcion, against heresies, against Gnostics, against everybody. That's not us. They loved writing these polemics, and it got them, they were a little too heavy-handed, let's put it that way, because they ended up condemning all the exact descendants of Jesus, the Nazarenes, as heretics. And that would be a kind of embarrassing, bad look for the Catholic Church. And so you got to find ways to obfuscate and just give enough, like gin up enough doubt that you can dismiss it away as a non-issue. And so if you take the Nazarene sect and just say, oh, let's pretend it was just a town called Nazareth, and it was just a where Jesus was from designation. Well, now you don't have to worry about explaining to all your adherents why we call Jesus' sect from 100 years ago heretics. It's a lot easier to just dismiss it away than have to deal with the nuances, right? So I think this campaign you talk about, Cam, of replacing Jesus the Nazarene with this false designation, Jesus of Nazareth, was to clear up this kind of messy detail that the church was already persecuting the followers of Jesus about a century after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, if he's just Jesus of Nazareth, it doesn't really mean much, that particular detail, because where you're from doesn't really matter, right? It's I mean, obviously we all have our childhoods and the things that form and shape us, but the idea being that if it's just Jesus from that town called Nazareth, and it's like, okay, well, that's a cool detail, now moving on. Whereas if it's Jesus the Nazarene, oh, interesting, who are the Nazarenes, and then now you have to open the can of worms, right? So
this next piece is, I think, the biggest piece of evidence from the first century that this was a real sect that did exist in the first century, because in Acts 24, verse 5 through 14, we have this testimony of Paul in one of his many, many trials for apostasy. He is accused of being a ringleader of the Sect of Nazarenes. So that's as specific as it gets, right? The Sect of the Nazarenes. We have the definite article there and everything. So this is a definite affiliation for a group ideology, not a town. But you'll still get Christian apologists say, no, even that phrase, the sect of the Nazarenes, means a town Jesus was from. I've had this debate with many Christians. And I get it, like people don't want to see what bothers their belief system. But Paul even follows up and says, yes, this I admit to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors. So there is no wiggling out of this. It uses the word sect twice and uses two different common designations that people knew of in the first century in those days. The Nazarenes were also called the followers of the way. And so that also ties together Jesus's first movement or group, that we know they were called the followers of the way through other sources in the book of Acts and outside of the Bible as well. And then Paul here equates the followers of the way with the Nazarenes, which corroborates what Epiphanius said, that the very first Christians, long before the Gentile tradition ever began, the first followers of Yeshua were called Nazarenes and followers of the way. And Paul confirms this in Acts 24. So that's probably our earliest attestation that the sect of Nazarenes, and if it was a sect by the first century, then it makes sense that it predates Jesus, right? But then Epiphanius goes on to say further. Epiphanius says, before Christ's advent, there were Nazarenes. They did not call themselves Christians, but kept to the Jewish law. They acknowledged both Christ and the resurrection, but were different from the Jews and Christians. So that's our point again, is that the Jewish Christians were sandwiched between two arch rivals, the Jews who performed daily curse rituals about them, and the Gentile Greek Christians who banned all their books and deemed them as heretical. It was a tough existence for the Nazarene Christians, and they were fiercely dedicated to following their path. Last attestation from Hippolytus says, the Nazarenes acknowledge Moses and believe in him, but they do not observe sacrifices. And this is, I think Hippolytus was writing in the 2nd century, so also a very early attestation. This is another interesting one from the Panorama as well. You see, Epiphanius says, thus Christ's holy disciples too called themselves disciples of Jesus, as indeed they were. But when others called them Nazarenes, they did not reject it, being aware of the intent of those who were calling them that. So the messianic prophecy, right? They were calling them Nazareans because of Christ, since our Lord Jesus was called the Nazarean, himself, as the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles say. So Epiphanius is also attesting here that the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles originally had it as the Nazarene designation, at least in Epiphanius's day. So that's another interesting point there. But the other big point here is in bold, when others called them Nazarenes, they did not reject it. So that may have just been a title that people started calling Jesus's disciples after his crucifixion, because Jesus was known as being a Nazarene. And so now maybe Jesus was part of this Essene type Judaism that he emerged from. But after his whole ministry and movement, which rocked Palestine in the 1st century, and then he gets crucified, and then now his apostles are trying to carry his message forward, what do other people start calling them? Nazareans, because Jesus was a Nazarene. And so now the word Nazarene has a very different connotation than it had when Jesus was alive, right? Now it means more of like followers of Jesus or followers of the way. So I think even that name took on a very different sectarian connotation after the crucifixion of Jesus.
Right. And I would add to that, that there's the sister group to the Nazarenes, as we all know, and we talked about extensively in our debate and many other podcasts, is the Ebionites. And that is an example similar here to where they potentially didn't call themselves necessarily that term until they started being called that as a derogatory sense. It could go either way. There's definitely a designation that we showed in the Dead Sea Scrolls that they saw themselves as the poor, but it's not like that's what they were necessarily trying to call their church at that time. It was a kind of understanding of their lifestyle and what they represented. And over time, because more people started to slander them with that notion about themselves, they're like, okay, well, yeah, we're the poor ones. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. We're the Nazarenes. And to your point too, I agree that, so many apologists or people that are listening that maybe come from the background that you're just certain that Jesus was from Nazareth. Many will say, well, the whole reason they're called the Nazarenes after Jesus is because he was from Nazareth, and then they called him the Nazarene, and then the followers the Nazarenes because he was from Nazareth, which is what Epiphanius is trying to propagandize in this text as well. But the point is we'll show if there's any evidence that there was a Nazarene people before Jesus and it has any connection to these groups in any way, then we can understand that this sect did exist before Jesus. But to your point, Aaron, it was a sect maybe with no central leader or potential figure that could have really taken the teachings to the next level like Jesus did. And so therefore, like you said, after Jesus, the sect of the Nazarenes becomes more specifically associated with him. But before that, it was a group of, say, Essenes or ascetics that had a very particular way that they viewed the Torah. I don't know how anyone could get around this and still come out on the other side thinking that Jesus is Jesus of Nazareth and it's not a sectarian term, or there can't be a set of Nazarenes before Jesus, because we have Pliny the Elder here in his book of natural history saying that in Kol Syria contains Apamia, which is separated by the river Marsyas from the tetrarchy of the Nazarene, which is, the area of the Nazarenes. And he's writing that in Latin too, so it's got a little bit of variation. But again, it's the same conversation around the different transliterations amongst all the languages in the region. But he refers to these people in Kol Syria. Now that overlaps. That's the same area that we showed earlier on the map, just across the Jordan, a little bit north near, Damascus, Transjordan region, northern Galilee. This is that area that he's referencing. Now, here's the kicker. Pliny the Elder died in like 76 AD, I think, or 73, somewhere around there. And when he wrote this, obviously it's sometime before his death. And most scholars assert that he was using maps and data for this writing dating all the way back to 2030 BC. So there's even a quote from, I believe it's Schonfield or Schoeps, one of the Jewish Christian scholars, who says that because he was using the data from these particular maps in 30 to, or so BC, that means the Nazarenes probably predated that to even 50 BC, to have that map and data to represent that. So now here we have bombshell evidence, direct, irrefutable evidence from Pliny the Elder, a Roman. He's got no stick in the game. He's got no, skin in the game on this whole conversation. He just says point blank, here are these people. They live in this particular area, and it overlaps with all of the areas to which the Nazarenes were settled, according to the patristics, according to the church fathers.
Now, Cam, real quick, isn't a tetrarchy, or maybe James, you might know this, a tetrarchy is a form of government where it divides the rulership into four different rulers or sections, right?
Yeah, that's it. There was a period in Rome where they had a tetrarchy, and there was two main, I believe they were called Caesars, and then two less powerful leaders. But it's kind of a confederacy in a way, where power is spread kind of for different subregions.
Yeah. So, I mean, right here, he's describing the Nazarene operate under a tetrarchy. So, like, they had a pretty sophisticated style of government even at this time.
Right. So they're a very established people, minimum in the first century when he's writing this. But again, he's utilizing evidence from as far back as 30 BC. So now what we have to understand is, like we said before, the town of Nazareth doesn't show up in historical record until 200 years after Jesus' death in Christian writings, which may or may not have some bias to it, as late as 400 years after Jesus in secular writing. But we have here a secular source of the Nazarenes existing in the first century, likely utilizing material from before Christ, from BC. So from sheer evidence alone, the weight of this outweighs the proof, just with how history works, how understanding historical data works. This evidence surpasses or surmounts the evidence that we have for a town called Nazareth being the genesis of this movement.
Oh, dude, I mean, this is big for a number of reasons, because if Pliny the Elder passes in 72 AD, let's say he's writing this, I don't know, 50, 60 AD, you don't get a movement that begins at the death of Jesus in 33 called the Nazarenes, right? And they flourish into such a massive population size that there needs to be a tetrarchy form of government to rule over these regions in just 2 decades.
Right.
That kind of evolution takes hundreds of years. And
Right.
so there's no way that this was a movement he's describing that had only been around for 20 years if they have a tetrarchy as their form of government.
Right. And we'll get into exactly how far back this predates in some potential connections, like I said earlier in the podcast, of how this corroborates with some of our Old Testament accounts of the tribes of Judah and settlements and everything. But clearly, yeah, this is a people group associated with the Hebrew faith that were out there for a really long time. And what I want to point to here is that Pliny the Younger to Trajan, he speaks of the Christiani. It's our earliest secular reference, to my knowledge, that we have of the Christians, period. It's one of the, another one of these kind of biggest attested quotes by Christian apologists of the Christian movement happening early in time. It's from Pliny, who is an emperor over the area of Turkey, and he's corresponding with Trajan, the emperor at the time, about these Christiani that are moving into the area. And upon them moving into the area, they're kind of meeting in secret, and he describes them the best that he can. And he says that they're meeting in the morning and they're saying prayers and they're eating innocent food. That raises some interesting points to the kind of vegetarian angle, that anti-sacrifice.
Checking some boxes off.
Right. They also reject Roman animal sacrifice even when facing death. So the correspondence with Trajan and Pliny is that Pliny's trying to say, hey, what do I do with these people? I'm trying to get them to renounce their faith. And if they don't renounce it in 3 times, then I kill them. And Trajan's like, good work. And he's like, just make sure that they perform the rites in your presence to ensure their refutation of their beliefs. And what that technically means, reading between the lines, is offering an animal sacrifice in their presence, because that's the way they observed their faith and their rituals in the kind of Roman pagan system, if you will. So he reports that after going about this method to weed out the Christiani, that the sacrificial temples and meat markets are firing back up again, because before that point, with the infusion of the Christianity in their area, all the temples were desolate. And it goes to show that there's a connection there with the early Christiani to the Nazarene. And like you said in Epiphanius, he says they were called Nazarenes by everyone at first until they began to be called Christians at Antioch. So this is maybe even evidence that the earliest Christians weren't infiltrated yet by Paulianity and everything. And we see that tension in Paul's letters. When Paul's writing to the different areas in the Greco-Roman world, multiple times this idea of eating food sacrificed to idols, the weak man eats only vegetables, don't raise any questions of conscience about the meat in the market. He's having this conversation with these groups because they have this type of belief throughout their area. And so he's trying to refute it. So there's even evidence that the earliest Christians were more like the Nazarenes, even by that designation, Christiani. It was just over time that they began to take on the more Pauline school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. All great points, man. And we're going to keep cooking because we're going to get even deeper into that here in a second. So this is going to be our third part of this presentation, Jesus, John, and the Transjordan movement. So this is the first piece of evidence here, is that John the Baptist's location is given as being beyond the Jordan, with the Transjordan region, right? In John 1:28. John appears to have been associated with the wilderness sects that rejected the temple sacrifices. And this is from Guise of Vermes, who's one of the most prominent Dead Sea Scroll scholars on planet Earth, and has really studied this deeper than just about anybody, and has one of the best Dead Sea Scroll translations I've found. And he also says John appears to be associated with these Essene type of Judaism in the Transjordan. Now, there's a parallel here with Joshua 22. Now, can you pull out this context of this passage for us, Cam?
So this is the piece from our own canonical Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible that points to maybe a genesis of these groups. So if you remember the story of Moses and the Exodus, the Hebrews are enslaved in Egypt. They're promised that they're going to make their way into the promised land, and God's got this space for them. And they wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. By the way, the prophet Amos says the whole time they were wandering in the wilderness, they never sacrificed animals. He asked the question, did you ever offer sacrifices to me in the wilderness? It's rhetorical, implying no. So they wander in the wilderness, keeping their pure faith. And then when they finally cross over into the Jordan, which Moses did not cross the Jordan into the promised land, if you remember, he stays to the other side. We're told he died there, but it might even get even more interesting, the implications of John 22 of maybe Moses didn't cross into the land because he didn't want to. Because once they crossed and they went into the land, the Canaanites were there. What were the Canaanites famous for? Extremely horrific sacrificial worship, not of only animals, but of human children, etc. So now we've got these tribes of Israelites moving into their promised land, but they're intermingling with the Canaanites, and they're finding themselves getting all up involved with this sacrificial ritual and mingling it with their customs, just like had happened in Egypt, right? So the point is, Joshua 22 tells this story that the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh, these are all the different names of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? These three tribes say, hey, we're out. They decide to go back across the Jordan and set up camp there. They don't want to stay in Canaan. It implies that there's something going on. They want to stay. And then in Joshua, it says that they build an altar on the other side of the Jordan, which would have been blasphemy. It even talks about it in the Hebrew Bible. Wait a minute, the altar is only supposed to be in the land. How are you building it over there? And the way the Old Testament writes it is they're saying, hey, we're right. We're going to build it here, but we're not going to offer sacrifices on it. It's just a witness. It's just a witness so that someday we're included in the promise of God, even though we're on the other side of the land. But that seems to be a clear kind of polemic against these people. They went over there to not participate in the sacrificial ritual, and they built altars of prayer, maybe some incense, and a gathering place, a more tent of meeting like they had in the wilderness, the tabernacle, the original tabernacle design. So I feel strongly, and I know I've talked to Ross Nichols about this, who we've had on our pod before around the Moses scroll, that this is a kind of Genesis moment for this offshoot of the Hebrew faith that's trying to preserve the original or more original law of Moses that didn't have all this liturgical sacrificial ritual going on. And lo and behold, it's the area where John the Baptist rises from, and eventually the Nazarene movement in Jesus. So that's all that I wanted to really touch, is that we can see in our Hebrew Bible that there's evidence that this movement goes all the way back to when the Hebrews entered the promised land. Some of them said, hey, we'll stick to the Transjordan and we'll keep our faith pure.
Wow, man. Thank you for unpacking that, dude. I've never connected those dots, and there's so many threads connecting here that are really adding up and kind of converging in the same direction. It's really hard to ignore this growing body of evidence, especially when you consider how many freaking prophets opposed sacrifices in the Old Testament. Right. Almost half of the prophets in the Old Testament angrily opposed animal sacrifices. And so it's like, yeah, it makes total sense that this would have been the most controversial issue in ancient Judaism, to the point that, I mean, dude, people split off over way less controversial issues theologically. Yeah. Look at Christianity with 50,000 freaking denominations. And it's like, little tiny minute differences about the Trinity, and then new denomination. It's like, how much more would there have been a split in Judaism over the widespread genocide of animals as this pagan practice that, I mean, there is no question. Animal sacrifice is a pagan practice, not a Jewish practice. It was a pagan practice long before, millennia before the Jews began practicing it. And so you can imagine that there would have been a segment of Jews very upset that their homeland, their religion had adopted paganism and was practicing it for money in the temple. Half the prophets angrily condemn it. At some point, it would have caused a schism. And we know that it definitely did, sometime probably between 600 to 300, or maybe it was a long process. But By the time we get to the 300s, we already have the Qumran group that opposes sacrifice, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we can't overstate what a scandalous issue animal sacrifices really were in the ancient world. And we have Jesus emerging from the Essene type of Judaism that rejected the temple system.
Right. And again, more evidence in the Old Testament, when Jeremiah is railing against the animal sacrificial system, there's specific verses where after he's just talking about how much of an abomination this thing is, he singles out Judea amongst the tribes of other, the Midianites and these other tribes that are participating in animal sacrifice as well. But he mentions specifically the tribe of Judah and not the other tribes, because there was that intermingling of that, what eventually became the focused southern kingdom of Judea. But then in the reign of Josiah during the reforms, when apparently this Passover sacrifice is instituted like it had never been done before, when in the scripture, when Josiah sends out representatives to the other tribes to say, hey, participate in this Passover with us, it says that those that are delivering the message are mocked by the northern tribes, which again, as a polemic from the Hebrew Bible, it's making them look bad, like they're, trying to, I guess,
mock Passover.
But the reality is they're probably just like, what are you guys doing? We've never heard of this before. Like, why are you, where is this coming from? We're good. Our forefathers built the altar, not for sacrifice.
Well, it also makes sense when you know that a lot of these Jews believed, and so did Yeshua, right, that the constant enslavement of the Jewish people was due to this paganism that had infiltrated Judaism. And they were like, guys, we got to make our religion pure again and get out this paganism, get rid of these temple sacrifices. God never commanded these, is what the prophets say. And imagine being part of the Jewish religion back in those days. And you're like, man, these freaking temple priests and scribes who just want to profit off sacrifices are the entire demise of our religion, because they won't stop practicing paganism in God's holy temple. And we can't get them to stop. And so we just keep getting enslaved by the Egyptians and Babylonians, Assyrians and Rome. Everybody's enslaving the Jews because they had lost the holy law given by Moses, which had no sacrifices in it. That would have been a very scandalous issue that would have enraged a lot of Jews in those days. And when you put yourself back in their shoes, you're like, yeah, this makes perfect sense. This would have been a very divisive issue in the ancient world.
Totally.
Just racking up spiritual debt and bad karma through this practice. And I'm sure they knew a lot of people and cared about certain people who were caught up in this cult.
I love that you bring up the word of cult, because, oftentimes, I know you guys are experiencing this. People will say that we're in some kind of cult by talking about this, that we're somehow brainwashed into some cult. Literally, it couldn't be more opposite from the truth. The earliest kind of reference to occultic behavior is the scholarly term, the sacrificial cult. That's literally what scholars call the pre-system of Hebrew Judaism and in the Greco-Roman world as well. It's the sacrificial cult because it's an occult practice. Now, apply that to modern day. Something interesting is that, in MK Ultra programs, which I'm sure probably some of your listeners have some familiarity with, there were these experiments, psychological experiments that were done in the US in the 60s, where they were playing around with how to psychologically manipulate human subjects to do certain things, including even going to war. There was talk of super soldiers, all of these kinds of things. Bottom line, the practice in the MK Ultra documents showed that one of the most effective methods of building a psychologically subservient and manipulatable person was to kill an animal. They would get cats and different animals, and they would have these people kill animals. And then they said what it would do is it would create what they called an alter, ironically, which is an alternate personality, a split in the psyche of the human being that they could.
You can't make this up, dude.
They could shelve their God consciousness and bring forth a fragmented version of their consciousness to be able to manipulate, so that they're not, referencing morality and their own ethics. They're just doing what they're told. And like you said earlier, Aaron, I truly think that this temple sacrificial cult meets the monarchy that God never wanted either, clearly throughout the scripture. It's a way to create a programmable people that are willing to go to war and dominate other territories and do these kinds of acts. Because what happens every time before they go dominate another one of these groups? They offer all these sacrifices every time. It's a way to get people on board. They get the taste of the blood and the smell of their blood in their system. They get the adrenaline pumping, and they're like, oh, they just brutalize these animals. Now they're ready to go kill some human beings. So I definitely see a connection there.
Yeah, didn't Pythagoras say that mankind will not stop killing each other in war and battle until we first stop killing animals?
Exactly. And Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, said, as long as there are slaughterhouses, there will be battlefields, because he drew that same connection. So
yeah, violence is violence. Life is life. And if you can justify one form of killing life, you make it 100 times easier to justify killing human life. And that should be obvious. Now, let's move to part 4, talking about these northern tribes, these ascetic enclaves that kind of comprise Essene-type Judaism. We have the Carmelites first at Mount Carmel. This is from Pliny the Elder, saying, the people known as the Carmelites live there, Mount Carmel, and they perform religious rites. On Mount Carmel is a temple without image or roof, and a sanctuary which is more famous without a deity than others are with one. So he's describing the Essene group at Mount Carmel here, and this is possibly aligned with Nazarean Essene values.
Yeah, I mean, Mount Carmel is the place where Elijah was ascended, and he's seen it to be this great teacher that basically, transmuted into heaven without even dying, right? And he's even compared to John the Baptist later. Ironically, they think he's a return of Elijah. And anyhow, the point is that there's clearly this group that's got this Essene type of behavior that we've been describing, living at this mountain. And there's even a temple that he's describing there that's different. And the way that it's different is that there's no deity at the temple. It's not like there's a particular deity that is being observed and carved into the temple or anything like that. It's this kind of nameless deity or nameless temple. And that really matches a lot of the worship of these groups as well, that they saw God as this omnipotent father that was kind of like an unnameable force in a way.
So in terms of Nazareth, then, we have these important points. There's no archaeological evidence, firstly, of a town called Nazareth from Jesus' time. There is no mention in Josephus or the Talmud or the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's no mention of Nazareth in any ancient Jewish text until after the fall of Jerusalem. And Matthew omits Nazareth, whereas Mark includes it, as we said earlier. So here's where we get back to the Josephus thread. Going back to the Old Testament book of Joshua, which we just talked about, Nazareth is not mentioned in the list of settlements of the tribes of Zebulun, although Bethlehem is mentioned, and also Hanathon, which is the heart of Galilee, and yet no mention of Nazareth. The first century Jewish historian Josephus names 45 cities of Galilee, and Nazareth is not one of them. Did he simply forget to mention it? This is unlikely, since he rarely missed anything and goes into great detail when he does describe the cities of Galilee. Josephus mentions the town of Jaffa, which is 1 mile from the city of modern-day Nazareth. And it is simply a stretch to say that Josephus simply forgot to mention Nazareth, especially since he lived in Jaffa for a while. He also led many military campaigns across Galilee. So to think that he missed a whole city 1 mile from where he used to live is a stretch. And then the Encyclopedia Biblica says, we cannot venture to assert positively that there was a city of Nazareth in Jesus' time. So there's more on the Josephus angle. And to your point, James, he lived 1 mile from Nazareth in Jaffa, where you could literally see it if it was really there, right? And we know that the Nazareth of today is just kind of a best guess from, I think, Constantine's wife in the 4th century, who wanted to create the town of Nazareth in honor of Jesus. Am I getting that right, Cam?
Yeah, Constantine, when he instituted Christianity as the Roman official religion, his mother Helena was, commissioned.
Right.
Yeah, his mother Helena was commissioned to go down to the Holy Land and name sites. And when you really dig into the weeds of it, where she put the famous church that's now in the modern city of Nazareth that you can go visit and see, that is on the map, and it is a real city. She instituted that church only based on what was claimed to be hearsay. There's no documentation or anything extant that shows that Helena had any proof or reasoning to put Nazareth there based on anything other than someone told me so. So, given the, again, I don't want to, it's not that I want to pick fun at that so much as I want to show, hey, that's the evidence for that side of the argument. Yet we've got Pliny the Elder literally naming a tetrarchy of the Nazarene people, the Nazarenes. And it's not only first century and Epiphanius, but this is secular proof all the way back to 2030 BC. I mean, this is nowhere near the same evidence in terms of a scholarly historical sense. There, the Nazarene sectarian supersedes the of Nazareth argument by a landslide, I'd say.
And it's such an important point with Josephus, who's a well-respected historian who was very thorough, and he lived 1 mile away. So Nazareth wasn't important enough for Josephus to include it in his histories, but it was important enough for them to put it on the sign of the cross with Yeshua. That doesn't add up.
Yeah, even if there was a Nazareth town, it doesn't change any of the argument we're making about the sect of the Nazarenes, because even in John 1:45, as we saw, it says, what good can come from Nazareth?
Right.
It should have been Jesus of Nazareth versus Jesus of Nazareth. I think Nazareth is just a later English translation of the Greek word, which is in the Greek, Nazara. So that was probably a region, not a town. But if it was a town, again, that has no bearing on the implications of the sect that we're showing you here.
Totally. But given, I will say just my own personal beliefs on this, which, take them with a grain of salt. But I feel because of the Helena story and what we do see in regards to this, I think there's some intention to create or at least emphasize this Nazareth misnomer to pull people off the scent of who the Nazarenes were. I think there is actual intention to it, because once you see it and you study this enough, and I encourage anyone who's listening that's interested, don't take our word for it. Go look at this material yourself. Go down the rabbit hole, take it as far as you can go. And I promise it's one of those things that once you see, you can't unsee. And you really start to notice, man, it seems like there was some kind of concerted effort to make sure no one ever found out who these Nazarenes were. And a great way to do it would be to just make them about Nazareth, so that's how
strategy. If I was in their shoes, it's the perfect way to deflect.
Now, this quote from Panarian chapter 18 from Epiphanius, also about the Nazarenes, he's sort of pulling out a lot of the points about their beliefs and practices we keep stressing of this Essene type Judaism, and a lot of parallels to Jesus here. He says, and so, though they were Jews who kept all the Jewish observances, they would not offer sacrifice or meat. So that's not all the Jewish observances. Mm-hmm. In their eyes, it was unlawful to eat meat or make sacrifices with it. And then he says, they claimed that these books are forgeries. So the books that declare sacrifices is what he means. These books of the Bible that declare sacrifices, the Nazarene Essene Jews called them forgeries, and that none of these customs were instituted by the fathers. This was the difference between the Nazarenes and the other Jewish sects of the day. So we also have this testimony in the Clementine writings, the recognitions and homilies, which we know are the Nazarene writings from later centuries. And they also say that the Torah was falsified by the lying pen of the scribes to institute sacrifices, and that the Nazarene Christians, the followers of Jesus, rejected those books as forgeries. So there's other testimony outside of just the church fathers that this was the belief of the Nazarenes. And so as we keep going here, we get into some more connections between Jesus and the Nazarene sect. We know that Jesus, based on our New Testament evidence, rejected the temple system, overturned the tables, and replaced Passover lamb with bread and wine. Jesus was nonviolent, Torah respecting, and reform minded. Then we have, of course, he quotes Hosea 6:6 on 2 occasions in the Gospel of Matthew. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now, Cam, we pulled out some of these points in our debate to show that Jesus was clearly from this Essene type Judaism. whether Ebionite, Nazarene, whatever label you want, he opposed the temple angrily and vehemently, which there is no other type of Judaism of that day that opposed the temple other than the Essene type of ascetic Judaism. We have a lot of good evidence that Jesus, his brother was a vegetarian, that Peter was a vegetarian, that all the Nazarenes were vegetarians. So likely if, Jesus's brother, as Hegesippus says, was raised from birth by Mary and Joseph as a vegetarian under the, Nazarite vow, it makes a lot of sense that Jesus was probably raised the same way. And so making a lot of these parallels, you can see a lot of this Nazarene philosophy in the Jesus of the Greek Gospels. So even though they tried to clean up Jesus and un-Jewish him as much as possible and Hellenize him as much as possible, you still see all these overtones of these staple Nazarene beliefs, notwithstanding water baptism. I mean, the Gospels open with water baptism, right, from John. And of course, communalistic living, which is, we know how Jesus's community was living in the first century in the book of Acts, that they lived in voluntary poverty, sharing everything in common, just like the Dead Sea Scroll group, just like these Essene type of Jews that the church fathers write about. So, I mean, we literally have such an overwhelming mountain of evidence that Jesus was part of this Essene type Judaism, clearly the Nazarean type Judaism. And there's really no evidence to the contrary, that meaning like that he was a Pharisee or a Sadducee. Like every piece of evidence we have, it's kind of funny when you think about it, it all points strongly in this one direction. And yet Christian apologists are tasked with the very difficult task to obfuscate this evidence. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. There's not many places you can go to try to say that none of this is true and Jesus had no affiliation with these people, when we have all of this evidence to show otherwise.
One of the strongest points is the Essene Nazarene tradition of nonviolence. I mean, I know Jesus overturned the tables, but he preached continuously for peace and for praying for your enemies. And the Essenes were well known for not participating in warfare. Can't say that for the other sects of Judaism. The Zealots were warlike. The Pharisees were warlike. Judaism as a whole is a fairly warlike tradition.
Very pro-war. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that differential. And then there's the slavery element as well. The Sadducees and Pharisees had slaves. They owned slaves, which was strictly forbidden. So this is another link from Jesus to the Essene Nazarene Ebionite tradition that utterly they were based in truth and love. I mean, they're not going to kill people and have slaves and kill animals. Pretty simple.
Right. So I want to draw one more connection here that just shows further with the previous information that we've been talking about, that this early sect of the Nazareans is in fact an earlier version that's related to the later version that Jesus is attested to. So if you actually go into the beginning of the breakdown of the Nazarenes with the S, it reads as this. It says, and this is number 18 or chapter 18 in the Panarion. It says, "Next I shall undertake and describe the sect after the Himero-Baptists." So he's saying they're Baptists. He's saying they baptize. Called the sect of the Nazarenes. They are Jews by nationality from Galadetus, Bishantis, and the Transjordan. Okay, so here's where we stop. The Transjordan. This is the area that all the later Nazarenes are found in. Bishantis in particular is related to that star, the Kochaba. These are all the same areas. And he says, but specifically, they claim to be descendants of Israel himself. Okay, so now we get into the territory of talking about the tribe of Reuben, Gad, half Manasseh that would have settled there and not crossed the Jordan. And how we know there's some connection here is because the Hebrews that did cross the Jordan, they intermingled with the Midianites, the Canaanites, the Idumeans, and all of this. There was a lot of infiltration from other groups in Judea, but these were, they were pure Hebrews still out here. So he's attesting to that. And I think that when you see that, you see an overlap, that they're in the same group, they're the same geographical location as the later Nazarenes he's describing. And he clearly, when he's describing the later Nazarenes, don't know where they came from. So it tells me they're the same group and he's just confused because he's seeking, like we always say, when people try to do apologetics, they seek to disprove so quickly that they don't even go and try to find the basic information. They just want to
No.
Yeah, they
focus
don't
on
do
the
their due diligence.
Well, they're
Right.
trying to harmonize the theology instead
Right.
of searching for the truth.
So
Yeah.
anyhow,
I mean, we know for a fact that Epiphanius has no clue what he's talking about because he gives two different origins for the Nazarene sects. And I was like, does he realize he just gave a different origin story than he did in the chapter earlier? He
Right.
says they were called Nazareans because Jesus was from Nazareth and Joseph was from Nazareth. So they all just called them Nazareans later. That's how the name got its origin. But then now what we're going to read here in the next section on the flight to Pella, and this is to me the biggest piece of evidence, the golden thread that proves the Nazarenes of later centuries in Pella are the identical descendants of the Nazarenes of Jesus's day, is that in this section, when he describes the flight to Pella, he says that the Nazarene sect got its origin because all the disciples of Jesus fled to Pella to escape the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And he says, and it is from this flight to Pella that the Nazarene sect had its origin. And I remember reading that in the plenary and being like, wait, dude, you just said in a different chapter, it had its origin because Jesus was from a town called Nazareth. And then he says, the Essenes and the Nazareans, they were called that because of the messianic prophecies. It's like, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. He's kind of guessing, but he's making these definitive guesses that sound like factual statements. But thank goodness we know that Epiphanius was not he didn't do his due diligence, let's say it that way, as you would say, Cam, because he gets a lot of stuff wrong. And he's a very problematic church father for scholars to study because he's so unreliable, kind of like Papias. It's like we call him Angry Epi on our text threads, it's kind of a joke because Epiphanius is just so angry, just hates everybody who's not a Catholic Christian like him and says horrible, disgusting things about what he hopes happens to these heretics and all this stuff. And his angry need to refute heretics comes out in these confusing, kind of conclusions he comes to. But let's see what he says, though, about the flight to Pella. And we're going to first start with a quote from Eusebius, another church father, who will confirm what Epiphanius says. He says, the people of the church in Jerusalem were commanded by a revelation to leave the city before the war and settle in a town called Pella. This matches Epiphanius's claim in the Panarion that the Nazarenes resettled in the Decapolis, or the Transjordan. So here's that Epiphanius quote. He says, this sect of Nazarenes is to be found in Berea near Pella, for that was its place of origin. See? Since all the disciples had settled in Pella after their remove from Jerusalem, Christ, having told them to abandon Jerusalem and withdraw from it because of the siege it was about to undergo. And they settled in Perea for this reason, and as I said, lived their lives there. It was from this that the Nazarene sect had its origin. This is such an explosive quote, you guys, because first we have Epiphanius fully acknowledging that this sect of Nazareans, who he's refuting as heretics, had their origin from the Jerusalem church. And he says, all the disciples, all of them settled in Pella. Now he means the Jewish disciples, not the Greco-Roman Greek disciples of Paul, but the Jewish disciples, the Nazarene disciples of Jesus, all went to Pella. Why? Because Jesus told them in a vision or a dream of some sort to abandon Jerusalem before it got sacked by Rome in 70 AD and go to Pella for safety. And they did. And this region, Pella or Perea, the Transjordan, is where all Jewish Christian groups have their origin for the next, 4 centuries. We know this because we have these attestations of this golden thread linking the Nazarene sect of Jesus with all the later sects of Nazarenes in the coming centuries, because they all fled to Pella. Why? Because Jesus told them to. And I just find it remarkable, you guys, that Epiphanius is giving the Nazareans credit that they were the group of the original disciples of the Church of Jerusalem, and that Jesus literally told them to go to Pella to flee the destruction. So it's like, does Epiphanius think that, they were like, they had it all right at first, and then, very shortly after they fled to Pella, they all became heretics? Like, I don't really know what his mindset is, but it seems at the very least extraordinarily arrogant and prideful to assume that you're more knowledgeable about what Jesus believed and taught than these Jewish disciples of Jerusalem who fled to Pella, who now you call heretics. It's a pretty bold claim to make, I think.
Totally. And again, bringing it all into the Gospels themselves for those people that feel most comfortable only utilizing that as historical data. I mean, like we saw, John the Baptist is in the Transjordan in this similar same area doing baptisms. Jesus goes into this area for his 40 days of fasting. A lot of his ministry is all over this area. He goes across into the Transjordan when he's speaking to people and giving a lot of parables. And the healing of the demon possessed man with the Roman legion, that's in the Decapolis, which is this same area across. And so it only makes sense that there was a base or a general a grounding or a rooting of this movement there in the wilderness where they knew they could get away with it. And then he and the 4,000 or whatever decided to poke their heads back into the land and head into Jerusalem. And really, like I like to say, it's like the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars heading into the Death Star, right? Like they decided to go down in there, but they're actually stationed out in Tatooine. They're actually stationed out in these areas. And so when everything really hits the fan, they have to go back out to the outskirts again, where they know they're safe, where they know they can, set up their communities and continue. And then I think what's really interesting, it was in one of the previous slides, is, you mentioned Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple and also telling them to flee to Pella. Well, one of the most famous verses of Jesus in regards to Peter in the church that everyone loves is that Jesus says, you are Peter, the rock, or the little rock, the pebble, and upon this rock, big rock, I will build my church. Well, a lot of scholars and linguists and even commentators in certain biblical scriptures talk about how Jesus and Peter were at Caesarea Philippi, which is at the base of Mount Hermon in the north, again, in this same territory. And when he's talking to Peter and he says, and on this rock, he actually was more likely pointing to Mount Hermon, the big rock that they're standing at the base of, and saying, on this rock, I'll build my church. And there's two interesting points with that, is that all of these areas in the Decapolis are all kind of at the foothills of that Mount Hermon. Like you could see it from all of these cities as this big towering mountain. And not only that, this is believed to be a central piece to the kind of Enochian, mystical, messianic vision and groups and scriptures that all of these people, followed. And when you look at the book of Enoch and you understand, a lot of people online are really fascinated by the book of Enoch. It was almost included in the canon, but then it wasn't. It's still in the Ethiopic canon. But it has all these parallels with the Genesis narrative and how the earth was formed, how humanity devolved into the state of chaos that they found themselves in the first century. And there's a story in parallel that when the fallen angels, cohabitated with humans and even bore children with human women, etc., that around that time, they started to sin against animals, and harm each other. And one of the angels taught them warfare and how to build swords and everything. And so in a way, Jesus is saying, hey, my church of the Nazarenes, I'm going to build it on this rock, Hermon, where it all started, where it all fell, where our degeneracy began. So he's like overtaking. And what does he say? The gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And that's always the old idea of Mount Hermon. Anyways, that's how we know that it's probably Mount Hermon he's pointing to, because Mount Hermon was known as the gates of Hades. It was known as the place that the fallen angels descended and corrupted the earth. And even in Genesis, in Genesis, it says the earth had become full of violence and corruption before the flood because of this Enochian kind of, fallen angel manipulation. And even in our biblical scripture, that word corruption for the earth is shekath, which the root means to slaughter or slay an animal. The priest who slays on the temple is called the shoket, and the method of slaughtering the animal and slitting its throat is called the shekita. It's all the same Hebrew root. So they're drawing on this idea of like what you were saying karmically. Hey, until our church overcomes this practice, Hades will prevail against it, but we're not, because we're going to set the record straight and go back to that original Mosaic law.
Damn, bro.
Epic.
The way you connect some of these dots, man, always has my head spinning. It's so impressive the way your mind works to connect these dots, but also just the research you put in to connect them. And you just helped me to connect something with that passage. The gate of Hades will not prevail against it. Well, Hades is a strictly Greek concept. It's nowhere in Judaism or the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, there is no hell or Hades at all. The idea of a hell, a burning afterlife torment chamber where bad people go, is a strictly pagan idea that has no origins in Judaism. They believed in annihilationism, right? And Sheol, the grave. So when Jesus says, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it, it might be a pretty obvious allusion to the idea that, like, and the paganism of the Greeks will no longer infiltrate Judaism, right? This temple system. It's like, this is Hades, the temple system, the bloodshed, the slaughter, the murder. They probably called the temple Hades or the gates of Hades, you know? And so he's saying, like, we're going to get rid of this paganism in our new church.
Yeah. And Hades, in a sense, being Greco-Roman, just ties to the idea that the Greco-Roman culture had this same narrative that's similar to the Enochian narrative. It was just the Titans, right? It was the gods that descended to Mount Hermon and got the wisdom, and they ruled the nations through all of their various powers and precepts. But it's the same story told through the Greco-Roman lens, right? And so, that, to your point, yeah, he's drawing those connections and knowing the audience he's speaking to, what their beliefs are, and how he's undercutting it with this original way.
Yeah, it's a lot of threads, man. The Titans of the Greek mythology, the Enochian, you know, archangels coming down, the Nephilim or whatever, the Anunnaki from the Sumerian tradition, and all that mythology. There is this story of, like, ancient divine beings of some sort coming down, probably ETs, right? And beginning to infiltrate this blood atonement idea into humanity of, like, hey, this is what the gods want, is murder. Yes, the gods crave murder. And if you're a negatively polarized ET civilization trying to create a planet that gets negatively polarized, what better thing could you inundate them with than blood atonement and blood sacrifice? I mean, that is the most negative possible thing there is the killing of a sentient being. And the idea that anybody would think that the benevolent Lord of the universe wants this for any reason is totally insane. And it makes sense that a lot of Jews thought it was insane and said, we don't want anything to do with this pagan practice, even going back to Joshua in the book of Joshua. I mean, this is a controversy as old as Judaism itself, essentially.
Well, one last piece, I know we're riffing so much, but I got to get this in there, is that what you just said reminded me, and I know that you have a deep love in your heart for this, both of you, the two ways, right? That you did a whole podcast on, the way of life and the way of death, essentially, that all these early, you know, Hebrew communities followed and spoke of. And it draws a connection to this point that you were just speaking of about, you know, this negative polarization from this idea of killing beings as a way towards righteousness. And when you look in the scripture, when Jesus says the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I come to give life and life abundantly, right? It's life and death. But here's what's interesting. I just realized this the other day. I haven't even told you guys this one yet. But when he says steal, kill, and destroy, that word kill there is actually the Greek thuo or thysate, which is to sacrifice an animal. So the enemy comes to steal, sacrifice, blood sacrifice, and destroy. And I come to bring life abundantly. The good, and that's right around, that's the same, it's tucked up with the verse, the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays his life down for the sheep, meaning the role reversal. I don't kill sheep for myself. I lay myself down in service for the sheep, for the lowest of all beings. It's a full system flip, right?
And Jesus said, I lay down my life for my sheep, not the other way around, because God desires mercy, not sacrifice. Not complicated. So to keep our train rolling here, I wanted to show this map of the flight to Pella, because again, this is our golden thread, historically speaking, with the attestations we have of what happened to the Jewish disciples of Jesus and where did they go from the destruction of the temple and settle down. And is there any correlation to where the 12 disciples of Jesus settled down and these later Jewish Christian groups? Well, of course there is, because here's Jerusalem, where their church was established, and they get warned in a vision to flee. So they go up towards the Transjordan and settle here in Pella. So this is the Transjordan region here. Here's Perea, which Epiphanius mentioned. And all Jewish Christian groups come pretty much right here from the next 3-4 centuries beyond. And so that's how we know they are linked. They are the descendants of the original Nazarene disciples.
It's clearly finally a spreading out of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem church. It needed to be established by James the Just, but now James the Just has perished, and they're going out towards, the Gentile areas again in the wilderness where they're from. But I think of Jesus in the Gospels again when he's speaking to, I believe, is it the woman at the well, and she's asking, well, my ancestors, the Samaritans, believe that we should worship on this mountain. I think it's in the Golan Heights or somewhere. But, we're told that we're supposed to worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus says, well, there's coming a time when everyone worships everywhere, in spirit and in truth. And I think that's what you see is that they're spreading out all over these areas and decentralizing. Really, a lot of people like the Jewish, that's what's unique about the Hebrew Christian, Jewish Christian movement as well, is they were often called Judaizers, like they were trying to just be this nationalistic group. But I think this is evidence that was never their intention at all, that they really believed that this was a faith for all the nations, and they wanted to spread out and start doing, their own evangelizing, so to speak, around the Greco-Roman world. They got their record straight, and then they went out and started preaching to the nations. And then Paul has to come behind with all of his letters and start speaking to these groups afterwards to start refuting some of the claims, and all the clashing between the Church of James begins.
One thing I would add is that the leader of the church in Pella was likely Simeon, who was also a relative of Yeshua. So we see, as James Tabor calls it, this dynasty continuing after Jerusalem. And this is just so swept under the rug of history. Will you ever hear mainline Christianity talking about a dynasty, a blood dynasty continuing? I mean, I think that's incredibly fascinating.
Yeah. And that dynasty being, again, in direct opposition to the blood dynasty of the priests, because it's the same family of priest and lineage from the family that killed Jesus, the high priest that killed Jesus, to the one that killed James, to the one that killed Simeon or Simon.
Hugh Schonfield was saying that this alliance between the Zealots and the Nazarenes kind of emerged because the Zealots weren't fond of the sellouts in the temple either. And when Ananias had James killed, the Zealots basically did the dirty work for the Nazarenes, because Ananias was viciously killed and a bunch of other priests after. But we know the Nazarenes were pacifists, so we were curious about, well, I don't think they would go and kill these priests, but it wasn't. The Zealots did the dirty work for the Nazarenes. So that was one of the rabbit holes we just discovered.
Well, and to your point, Reza Aslan opens his book, his famous book on Jesus. He's actually a Muslim scholar, but he did intensive work into the historical Jesus. And his whole opening story of his famous book, Zealot, is about this idea that James was so popular with everyone, like you said, that once he was killed, the Zealots took it upon themselves. And literally one of the Zealots named himself James the Just out of wanting to rectify the name of James the Just. And that guy was the one who, on a high holy day, entered the temple, found the high priest, and cut his throat from behind him in the middle of the temple yard, like in the middle of the court.
Oh my goodness, dude.
Yeah. I mean, talk about
Imagine making a Chosen episode about that.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't get any more Game of Thrones crazy than some of these stories. But to your point, James, like this isn't, these violent ones, they aren't the actual close followers of the Nazarenes and the James. They were nonviolent, but it just goes to show you that even the violent ones saw them as so high esteem. Like even in nowadays, how often do you see these different political factions where one is violent, one is nonviolent, like, you know, say Martin Luther King and say Malcolm X or whatever, where typically the more violent or more confrontational ones don't really like the pacifist ones. They want them to step it up. But how crazy that this violent activist decides to embody James the Just and you know, revenge him, I guess. He was that popular, like you said.
Yeah, James was the people's champ. There's no question. Eusebius writes this, Hegesippus writes this, that James was the only priest appointed by the people who was permitted to enter the holy place, the Holy of Holies. And he wore linen garments like a priest would, and he was the people's opposition high priest to the Herodian priests that everybody hated. Because for those of you who aren't familiar with first century history, when Rome occupied Palestine and took over Jerusalem, they immediately King Herod started taking a piece of the pie from the temple, saying, hey, I'll take some of those nice profits y'all are making on those nice little sacrifices. You better give me a cut off the top. And in return, I'll make you guys priests. I'll appoint you priests. Because it was now Herod's temple, right? And he can do whatever he wants at the temple. So he's the authority, and he says, I'll make you my priest if you give me a cut of your pie. And so you had a lot of these Jews who were willing to sell out their own people to take this luxurious position of being a Sadducee priest, a Herodian priest at the temple. And so just like tax collectors who were also hired by King Herod in Rome to tax their own people, they were seen as ultimate backstabbers and betrayers. And these people were doing the dirty work of Herod. There was like this total splitting in Judaism in those times between like the Herodians and the normal Orthodox Jews who didn't want to be oppressed by these people in this whole system, but they didn't have a choice because they're occupied by Rome. And so what happens after Jesus is crucified in 33, Jesus, as we know from the Gospel of Thomas and many church fathers, appointed James, his blood brother, to be his appointed successor of his church. And he was for almost 30 years. And then he gets killed by Ananias because Ananias, who's the Herodian high priest, doesn't like this populist priest, brother of Jesus, the heretical Messiah, is starting this new movement everyone hates. He doesn't like this guy challenging his authority, so he takes it upon himself to just have this guy stoned without a trial. And it absolutely ignites Jerusalem on fire because he was like sort of like the Trump of the day, right? He was like the people's choice against the empire, the establishment. And then they killed him. And we probably would have seen something similar if they had gotten away with that with Trump, right? And assassinated him. We would have seen the people get really angry about that because the people were trying to elect this guy who the establishment doesn't like. Same thing happened in James's day. James was the people's choice.
I'm James the Just.
No one's ever been more just than me. I'm the most just.
I am the justest of all.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah, I mean, it's clear in like your reference to the Gospel of Thomas, isn't that where he says it is for James that the whole universe has come into being or something like that. Like he has this high regard just for how pure and just James is. And I think I love that we're coming to a close with James again, because he's so key to this whole Nazarene argument as well. Because again, there's so many ways that you could try to pull apart this argument, and I don't think be very successful with everything we presented. But when you put the final piece of James the Just in the mix, it really ties everything together, because someone could say, well, we don't have any direct evidence from Jesus that say he abstained from flesh. And these Nazarenes that Epiphanius is talking about, they did. He ate the Passover lamb. He ate fish, yada, yada, because of the Gospels. Now, we know through the Hebrew Gospel and other things that we've talked about on this podcast, that's all likely not historically accurate. But let's just put that aside and let's just look at James the Just, because all Christian biblical theologians and secular alike agree that James the Just led the Jerusalem church, and it's multiply attested that he abstained from flesh his entire life since his birth. So now we've got that connection drawing him to that early
just
Nazarene
like Peter says in Acts 10, by the way.
just like Peter. And then we've got him and him and Paul clashing. And Paul's constantly saying, oh, it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And don't worry about those who say to eat only vegetables. They're just weak in the faith. He's talking about James. He's having his contention with James at this time. And all he had to do was just do the mic drop statement and say, hey, Jesus ate meat. So end of story. But he never says that.
Yeah.
So that points to the direction that you've got John the Baptist before Jesus, who's got at least atonement baptism for the remission of sins, which is a testament to being anti-temple sacrifice. Right. And then you've got James on the other side participating in non-flesh consumption of these kind of things. So why would Jesus be sandwiched there in the middle between these two leaders carrying on the movement? When John the Baptist was beheaded, he took over the followers. When Jesus was taken out, James took over the followers. Why would he be the outlier that for some reason wouldn't be observing these same practices? It's impossible. And it doesn't make any sense. The Gospels attest to it. He cleansed the temple. He freed the animals. It's drawing the same lineage.
And for James to have never eaten meat since he was a kid, he would have to be born into a family and a specific culture that doesn't eat meat. And that's where the Nazarene connection comes in.
Right.
Yeah, there are no records of other religious or spiritual movements where the followers of the leader that they are a movement about don't practice the same beliefs their master did. Like they have these totally different beliefs. And it's like our earliest attestations of the Nazarenes all say, in fact, every Jewish Christian group, not even just the Nazarenes, all of them, Essenes, Ebionites, Carmelites, Elkosites, Nazarenes, all of them, don't eat meat, abhor sacrifices, believe the Torah is falsified. So it's like, why would you get all these common beliefs amongst people that follow Yeshua, but Yeshua didn't have any of those beliefs?
Earlier followers.
It makes no sense at all. But then when you add James in, to your point, Cam, it makes even more sense that Jesus must have been like this, because in Acts 15, you have Paul before James, and they're deliberating over, should we make Gentiles follow the Torah or not, and stuff. And James, being very mystical in his spirituality, like Yeshua said, they don't need to follow all the commandments of the Old Testament and stuff. But there are a few important things to us that you must ensure the Gentiles obey. And 3 out of 4 of them are about not eating meat or meat sacrificed to idols. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, anything with blood or anything that's been strangled. Okay, that excludes all meat, you guys. And then the 4th is sexual fornication. And so again, we can't overstate how huge this is. This is the brother of Yeshua, the Nazarene. And when he's asked, what are the most important things, James, the brother of Jesus, that you want the Gentiles to follow? He says, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols or blood or anything that's been strangled, or sexual fornication. Now, do you think, guys, that it's probably logical to conclude that if that was the most important thing to James, the brother of Jesus, it may have been important to Jesus as well?
Yep. Pretty safe conclusion. And then that leads you to say, well, hey, so what evidence do we have? And that's, I think, the rabbit hole I would encourage everyone who's listening to go down. We've talked about quite a lot of it amongst different podcasts, etc. But once you dive into the Hebrew gospel that the Nazarenes and the Ebionites used, and we've talked about the Syriac version of Luke, which has Jesus saying, "Don't let your heart become heavy with the eating of flesh." We have attestation to this through different sources. It's just been pushed to the fringe of the conversation, but now it's time to bring it back to the center and really take this moment to acknowledge the truth about Jesus the Nazarene, who the Nazarenes were. And maybe this, I know people have said this in our comment sections and stuff like that this feels like a new kind of reformation. But I like to call it a restoration. I think that's what Jesus and the Nazarene.
There we go. We want a restoration, baby.
We want a restoration. Yeah. So they're trying to restore that Edenic ideal, that Mount Hermon fall infiltration of blood ritual and all of this back to the pure way. And they really believed that if people could find this truth, and it's not hard, like Jesus said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. It's simple. It seems like it's a big jump, but just these simple precepts of respecting others, doing unto others, has a ripple effect and a chain reaction all around the world that the next thing you know, we wake up one day and we're all in the kingdom of heaven, So
yeah,
That's what I feel is going to happen the more and more this information comes to light, as a restoration of that faith.
Amen. One person embodying love and peace in their heart has such a profound influence. And using James the Just as an example, David Hawkins is it David Hawkins? In his book Maps of Consciousness talks a lot about how people who exude love or enlightenment and peace on the scale can hold a balance with hundreds of thousands of people who are in hate or greed or whatever their vibration is. And many believe that when James was killed, that this was the reason. It was actually like a metaphysical reason that Jerusalem fell into chaos, because this extremely powerful soul who just exuded such goodwill to all beings and all humans was no longer there to sustain the energy. Shortly thereafter, all hell breaks loose. And this is verified by all these experiments. They did experiments in it was an Israel-Lebanon war a couple decades ago, and they did experiments with people going in and praying for peace, and violence reduced by like 75% during the period they were praying. So every action, every prayer, every thought we do for peace, for love, for compassion for others, like Cam said, has massive ripples through the universe.
So well said, man. Yeah, I mean, that's what our last episode was about, the power of prayer. And yeah, I mean, James was so righteous. I would love to know. I mean, Hawkins is gone now, but I would love to know what James calibrates at on that scale, because he obviously puts Yeshua at 1,000. James wasn't far behind, man. I mean, this is why I love studying James, is because the good news is there was a whole lot more enlightenment in Mary and Joseph's DNA than just went to Jesus, right? Jesus had a very enlightened brother. And there is no negative record of James from anyone, opponents or otherwise, in history. Every single attestation of James the Just is like, whoa, this guy was on another level. He was the most righteous man anyone had ever met. And, you know, you have to ask the question, don't you? What inspired this guy, the brother of Jesus, to be so freaking noble and righteous to the point where he gets stoned alive? And the records we have from Hegesippus, very early attestation to this, says that while James is having his brain bashed in with stones, he cries out alongside his brother on the cross, "Forgive them, Father. They know not what they do." And he says one of the Roman guards or whatever, I think, who's watching over this, starts crying out, "Please leave this man alone. He's clearly a righteous man. Listen, he prays for you while you murder him." And as one of I think it might have been a priest, a Jewish priest, is advocating for James. Another Jewish priest comes out with a fuller's club and bashes James' brains and skull open and kills him. And it's like he went to his death just like his brother did. And I'd almost rather be crucified and die that way than to be stoned alive. You know, it's a pretty brutal way to die. And he still was able to have the same words as his brother, "Forgive them, Father." And you got to ask, what made James so righteous? And if, again, we're talking about the historical Jesus in this episode, the real man who really lived and was a real person like you and I, put yourself back there in the first century. James the Just was a real person like you and I. What do you think inspired James, you guys? How could it be anything other than his big brother, Yeshua? I mean, can you imagine your older brother being Jesus? You would absolutely idolize him. I mean, he would be your entire fixture and goal of your life, is to be like my big brother Yeshua. And James did it. I mean, props to James. He absolutely filled those massive sandals that his brother left for him, right? Everyone attests that James led the church with the utmost righteousness of Yeshua himself and was the perfect successor to Jesus. And then his brother Simon after him was the next successor, also a brother of Jesus. And the descendants of Jesus, who was it, guys? Schoenfield writes about this, but there's an early attestation who says that it was the very kinsman of Jesus himself who led the church for a number of decades afterwards, even his cousins and stuff. There's a story of the two cousins, later cousins of Jesus, who get called before a Roman emperor on trial. And they attest, yes, we are, kinsmen of Yeshua, and they get persecuted for it. I mean, the the dynasty, the Jesus dynasty, as Tabor talks about, was a real thing. And it was in the Nazarenes that went to Pella and fled from Jerusalem. And they got persecuted by Paul's church. I mean, what an unbelievable story that's been totally forgotten by history because of its very scandalous implications for the world's biggest religion. It makes total sense that this story hasn't been told yet, like we've told it today, but it doesn't minimize the incredible power of resurrecting this story and telling it for the first time of, hey, this is where Jesus really came from. He came from a real group of people that had a long history of very virtuous and noble beliefs and practices, so much so that they were willing to split off of Judaism to upkeep them. I mean, it makes sense that Jesus came from an incredibly virtuous, spiritual, mystical sect like this, and I think the world deserves to know that. And then further, the world deserves to know what happened to the followers of Jesus, because, spoiler alert, they didn't go to Rome and write a bunch of epistles that are in our Bible today. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, 1st, 2nd Peter, these epistles in the name of the disciples were absolutely, obviously not written by the actual Jewish disciples of Jesus for many reasons we could go into later. But Epiphanius said, all the disciples fled to Pella because Jesus told them to. So we don't have any disciples of Jesus writing epistles in Rome and Asia Minor because they were all in the Transjordan region where he says they settled and lived there and lived their lives there and continued their church there for many more decades. So this, guys, has been such a pleasure to go through with you. And thank you, Cam, especially for pioneering much of this research we've done today. We've all been putting our heads together for quite a while to build this episode up. It's a behemoth, as you've seen today, with all the different historical angles we got to cover. But I hope we've proven to all of the Jesus Way followers that now you can defend this point in conversation with Christian and non-Christian friends, that Jesus came from a very mystical sect of Judaism that had all the right ideas and beliefs and practices, that we should be proud of knowing where Yeshua came from, and that he actually took his lineage a step further, right? And made it even more mystical and noble and righteous than it was before him. And so we have a lot to thank Yeshua for that, I think. So any closing remarks from you guys?
Sure. Yeah. I'd love to just say, to come full circle back to the earlier conversation, and you mentioning the research in the past leading up to this moment and everything with Christspiracy, and how I said I had to kind of stand up to the behemoth of Netflix to really push this point forward. So much of that, when it really comes down to it, like you were saying of James being inspired by Jesus, I'm inspired by Jesus, and I always have been my whole life. And I think in that moment, I could feel the weight of like all of these people whose story and truth was just blotted out of history. It could almost bring a tear to my eye thinking about, John the Baptist. We were talking about family lineage. He's Jesus's cousin, and he's out there bringing the people back into the wilderness, back into the purity, giving them water for their cleansing as opposed to blood of animals. And he's standing up saying, hey, don't kill something or sacrifice something else for your own wrongs. Take it upon yourself. Take self-responsibility. Come out here to the wilderness, learn the way, cleanse yourself in the holy waters. And he was beheaded for it. And then not long after that, Jesus comes along, takes it to the next level, straight into the temple. He's crucified. Then James steps up to the plate, and like we're saying, so righteous that it's described that his knees were like, I forget the wording, but his knees were swollen, and camel's knees from being on his knees praying so much for the people and for Jerusalem. And then crying out, forgive them, when he's being stoned to death. And that carries on when you learn about the Council of Ancyra, where Christians are condemned who refuse to participate in flesh consumption. And when you learn about the Albigensian Crusade, that literally some of these, Christian aligned groups were forced to kill animals in the presence of their enemies to prove whether or not they were about their faith, and they would refuse and they would be killed. There's record of them sending chickens out into the village and forcing these people to kill the chickens, and they wouldn't do it. And then they died. Instead of they put their life on the line instead of the chicken. Same thing Pliny, like we learned earlier, Pliny the Younger is talking about these Christians refusing to kill animals and dying for it. And to me, that's where it really comes down to, I know one of the most challenging aspects of this story for people who grew up in creedal Christianity is like, well, are you saying Jesus' sacrifice didn't matter? Because all of this animal sacrifice prefigured Christ. No, it makes it matter that much more. It makes it land. Jesus
Just
was
the opposite.
it was the ultimate sacrifice of self. All of these individuals were so devoted to their cause and devoted of bringing the kingdom of heaven on earth by respecting all sentient life on earth and each other, that they were willing to kill them, to have themselves be brutally murdered in the stance of it. And I think that's the truth. Killing some other animal is not a sacrifice. Killing some other being, that's no sacrifice to you, really. I know people like to say, oh, they brought their first fruits, their largest one, but you can grow another animal. You can do what the true sacrifice is, what you of yourself, the animal within, stopping yourself from brutalizing others. And so I get my inspiration from Jesus and these people to make those kind of decisions like I had to make with Netflix. And I just really hope that everyone listening here can feel that same fire and understand, like, hey, it's up to us. It's up to you to spread this message, talk about it with people. You don't even have to know every fact. Just start asking questions. That's what Jesus did. He ran around asking people questions, challenging them with the right questions. And it's time we vindicate this message, So
vindication, that's the right word to use here, man. This is a vindication of Jesus and the Nazarenes. And it makes sense, to your point, Cam, why the Nazarenes and the Jewish Christian groups kept their same exact beliefs and practices for like 4 to 5 centuries without really any evolution, hardly, that we can notice. That is so rare in religious history that happens like that. And it shows you the incredible men of God they had to look up to in their tradition. John the Baptist, Yeshua the Nazarene, James the Just, Peter, like all of these incredible men of God were their own ancestors. And so they were proud of their heritage and their beliefs, and they were willing to die for it and be persecuted for it. And they did. And their story deserves to be told.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm super inspired by both of y'all's closing remarks. And I'll just add that to take this wisdom of the ancient Nazarenes and bring it into today, how can we walk this in our own lives? And there's a few main concepts that we can integrate. The first one and most important one is compassion for all life. Living a life, a heart set of compassion for all beings and for loving your enemies, casting away judgment for others. That is first and foremost most important. A second is spending time in nature and water immersion. This was extremely important to the Nazarenes, and they considered it really a fundamental part of their spiritual practice. And we've talked in other podcasts about the intelligence of water and its purifying properties. And then after that, it's a life of prayer and dedication to God, loving neighbor, and opposing war, I believe, is part of it. Really opposing violence wherever it shows up in the world and in life. And I'm sure you guys could add some other pragmatic ways that people can take this Nazarene philosophy into their lives today in 2025.
Well, it's funny you say that, because you can see a little bit how the Nazarene Essene type Jews in those days would have been seen a bit like hippies in the 70s, right? You're like, these ascetic Jews who oppose killing and sacrifice in the temple, and they live out in the desert and eat simple food and all that stuff. They fast, they bathe in the ocean for the purification. They're like Jewish hippies, man. What good can come out of Nazara, those hippie Jews? Like, that kind of was probably how the Orthodox Jews saw them and wrote them off. And it wasn't until one of those hippies made his way into Jerusalem and changed the whole world forever. And that's why we're here today, to talk about Yeshua the Nazarene and his followers. So, Cam, James, thank you for joining me for this epic episode into the history of the Nazarenes. Thank you to our viewers for sticking through this walloper of an episode. And hopefully now, when we use the name Jesus the Nazarene, it has a little more implications for you, and you can connect to the true meaning and symbolism of that title, Yeshua the Nazarene. So until next time, as always, love God, love people, and we'll see you all on the next episode of the Jesus Way podcast.